The Gothic peoples emerged from the fog-shrouded forests and windswept shores of Scandinavia during the early centuries of the Common Era, their origins deeply rooted in the archaeological record of southern Sweden and the Baltic Islands. Modern excavations in the Götaland region have revealed a sophisticated material culture that bears striking similarities to later Gothic artifacts found across Eastern Europe, suggesting a clear line of cultural transmission from north to south. The distinctive boat-shaped brooches, elaborate belt buckles, and characteristic pottery styles discovered in Swedish burial sites from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD display unmistakable connections to the Vielbark culture that would later flourish in the Vistula River Valley. Gotland, the largest island in the Baltic Sea, presents perhaps the most compelling archaeological evidence for Gothic origins. The island's rich burial grounds contain thousands of graves spanning several centuries, with the earliest showing clear continuity with later Gothic practices. Stone ship settings, where graves were outlined with stones arranged in the shape of vessels, demonstrate the maritime culture that would enable Gothic expansion across the Baltic. The abundance of Roman coins found in these burials, dating from the 1st through 3rd centuries, indicates extensive trade networks that connected the island's inhabitants with the broader European economy long before their famous migrations began. Linguistic analysis provides additional support for the Scandinavian origins of the Goths. The Gothic language, preserved in fragments of Wulfila's 4th century Bible translation and various runic inscriptions, belongs to the East Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. Comparative studies reveal significant similarities between Gothic and Old Norse, particularly in vocabulary related to warfare, kinship, and religious practices. The Gothic word Reiks, meaning ruler or king, shares obvious connections with the Old Norse Rika and the modern German Reich, while Gothic guards, house or enclosure, parallels Old Norse Garda and appears in numerous place names throughout Scandinavia. The archaeological record traces the Gothic migration route through distinctive burial practices and material culture. The Vielbark culture, which flourished in the Vistula River Valley from approximately 50 to 400 AD, represents the clearest archaeological manifestation of Gothic presence in Poland. These sites reveal a population that practiced both cremation and inhumation, with the dead buried alongside weapons, jewellery, and everyday objects that Mirror finds from Gotland and southern Sweden. The characteristic lack of weapons in many Vielbark graves initially puzzled archaeologists, but this pattern likely reflects specific ritual practices rather than a peaceful society, as weapon deposits appear in separate ceremonial contexts. Settlements in the Vielbark culture region demonstrate sophisticated agricultural and craft production capabilities. Excavations at sites like Koaleuco have revealed substantial wooden longhouses, some exceeding 40 metres in length, capable of housing extended families and their livestock. These structures featured central hearths, storage areas, and workshops where skilled artisans produced the distinctive metalwork and pottery that characterises Gothic material culture. The presence of Roman imports, including glass vessels, bronze implements, and luxury goods, indicates that Gothic communities maintained extensive trade relationships even during their migration period. The primary literary source for Gothic origins remains Jordanes' Getica, written in Constantinople around 551 AD. This work, based largely on the lost multi-volume history by Cassiodorus, preserves crucial information about Gothic traditions and mythology, though it must be approached with appropriate scholarly caution. Jordanes describes the Goths' ancestral homeland as Skansa, which he characterises as an island in the Northern Ocean that served as the womb of nations and the origin of peoples. His account places particular emphasis on the fertility and abundance of this northern homeland, describing vast forests, numerous rivers, and populations so numerous that they required periodic emigration to prevent overpopulation. The legendary King Berig occupies a central position in Gothic origin mythology as preserved by Jordan S. According to this tradition, Berig led the first Gothic migration from Skansa, commanding a fleet of only 3 ships that carried his people across the northern seas to the southern shores of the Baltic. Upon landing, the Goths supposedly encountered and displaced the Rugi, establishing their first continental settlements in the region that would later become known as Gothis Kansa. While the historical accuracy of these specific details remains questionable, the core narrative of maritime migration from Scandinavia finds strong support in archaeological evidence. The crossing from Skansa, as described in Gothic tradition, involved more than simple population movement. Jordanes preserves accounts of the Goths' systematic exploration of their new territories, their encounters with established populations, and their gradual adaptation to continental European conditions. The migration apparently occurred in multiple waves over several generations, with different Gothic groups establishing distinct territorial bases that would eventually evolve into the major tribal confederations known to Roman historians. Early Gothic society exhibited characteristics typical of Germanic peoples during the migration period, with important distinctive features that would influence their later historical development. Archaeological evidence suggests a hierarchical social structure headed by warrior aristocrats who controlled substantial agricultural territories and commanded the loyalty of free farmers, craftsmen, and slaves. Burial goods from elite graves include elaborate weapons, jewellery, and imported luxury items that demonstrate both martial prowess and participation in long-distance trade networks. The institution of the Thing, or popular assembly, played a crucial role in Gothic governance, with free men gathering to discuss legal matters, military campaigns, and leadership selection. This democratic element coexisted with strong royal authority, creating a political system that balanced aristocratic leadership with popular participation. Kings derived their legitimacy from both military success and claimed descent from divine ancestors, particularly the god Gaut, from whom the Gothic name itself may derive. Religious practices among the early Goths centred on the worship of Germanic deities, with particular reverence for war gods and fertility goddesses. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals elaborate ritual deposits of weapons, jewellery, and food offerings intended to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The practice of weapon sacrifice in bogs and lakes, well documented in Scandinavia, appears to have continued among Gothic communities in Poland, suggesting strong continuity in religious traditions despite geographical displacement. The development of distinctive Gothic material culture accelerated during their residence in the Vistula region. Metalworkers perfected techniques for producing the characteristic eagle-headed fibulae that would become symbols of Gothic identity across Europe. These brooches, often crafted from silver and decorated with intricate geometric patterns, served both practical and symbolic functions, securing clothing while displaying the wearer's status and cultural affiliation. The evolution of these designs can be traced through archaeological finds, showing increasing sophistication and regional variation as Gothic communities expanded and encountered new influences. Pottery production among the Vielbark culture Goths demonstrates both continuity with Scandinavian traditions and adaptation to local conditions. The characteristic handmade vessels, often decorated with impressed patterns and geometric designs, served both utilitarian and ceremonial purposes. Large storage jars indicate settled agricultural communities capable of surplus production, while smaller decorated vessels suggest ritual use in religious ceremonies and burial practices. The Gothic exodus from the Vistula River Valley during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD marked the beginning of one of the most significant population movements in European history. Archaeological evidence from the final phases of the Vielbark culture reveals a systematic abandonment of settlements across Poland, with entire communities dismantling their longhouses and burying precious objects in hoards that would remain hidden for centuries. The migration route eastward followed river valleys and ancient trade paths, with Gothic groups moving in waves toward the fertile steppes beyond the Carpathian Mountains. The destination of this massive population movement was the Pontic-Caspian steppe region, a vast expanse of grassland stretching from the Dniester River to the Don, encompassing much of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia. This territory offered several advantages that attracted Gothic settlers: abundant pasture land for livestock, fertile soil suitable for agriculture, and strategic positioning along trade routes connecting the Baltic with the Black Sea and Mediterranean markets. The region's previous inhabitants, primarily Sarmatian tribes and scattered Scythian remnants, had established a mixed economy combining pastoral nomadism with settled agriculture, creating a foundation upon which Gothic newcomers could build. The archaeological signature of Gothic settlement in the Pontic steppe appears in the form of the Chernyakov culture, named after a village near Kiev where characteristic artifacts were first systematically excavated. This culture, flourishing from approximately 200 to 400 AD, represents a unique synthesis of Gothic traditions with local influences and demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of Gothic communities to new environments. Chernyakov sites extend across a territory of roughly 100,000 square kilometres, indicating the scale of Gothic settlement and their success in establishing territorial control over vast areas. Chernyakov settlements display a sophisticated understanding of landscape utilization and defensive positioning. Villages typically occupied elevated locations near rivers, providing access to water while offering natural protection against potential attacks. The largest settlements, such as those excavated at Componesti in Romania and Budesti in Moldova, covered areas exceeding 100 hectares and housed populations numbering in the thousands. These sites feature carefully planned layouts with distinct residential, craft production and storage areas, suggesting centralized authority capable of organizing large-scale construction projects. The material culture of Chernyakov sites reveals a population that maintained strong connections to Gothic traditions while incorporating elements from their new environment. Pottery production combined handmade vessels in traditional Germanic styles with wheel-thrown ceramics showing Roman and local influences. The distinctive grey-black pottery, often decorated with polished surfaces and geometric patterns, became a hallmark of Chernyakov culture and appears consistently across the entire region of Gothic settlement. Metalworking reached new levels of sophistication under Chernyakov culture conditions. Gothic smiths produced elaborate silver and bronze fibulae featuring intricate animal designs and geometric patterns that would influence European decorative arts for centuries. The famous Pietro a Sela treasure, discovered in Romania and dating to the 4th century, demonstrates the extraordinary skill of Gothic craftsmen in working precious metals. This hoard contains a massive gold eagle fibula weighing over 650 grams, decorated with garnets and featuring detailed featherwork that required advanced techniques in repousse and granulation. Agricultural practices among Chernyakov communities combine traditional Germanic farming methods with steppe pastoralism. Excavations reveal extensive grain storage facilities, including large sunken granaries capable of holding surplus crops for extended periods. The cultivation of wheat, barley and millet provided the agricultural foundation for population growth, while cattle, sheep and horses supported both subsistence needs and trade activities. The presence of iron ploughshares and other agricultural tools indicates intensive farming practices capable of supporting dense populations. The integration of diverse tribal groups within Gothic territories created a complex social and political landscape. The Chernyakov culture encompasses not only Gothic settlers, but also Sarmatian tribes, Dacian remnants, and various other Germanic peoples who had migrated into the region. This multicultural population required new forms of political organization that could accommodate different traditions and maintain stability across vast territories. Sarmatian tribes, descendants of the nomadic peoples who had dominated the Pontic steppes for centuries possessed sophisticated military traditions and extensive knowledge of steppe warfare. Their heavy cavalry tactics, employing armoured horsemen with long lances, would significantly influence Gothic military development. Archaeological evidence from Sarmatian burial sites reveals elaborate horse harnesses, scale armour, and weapons that demonstrate their martial culture. The integration of Sarmatian warriors into Gothic military structures provided the Goths with enhanced mobility and tactical capabilities that would prove crucial in their later conflicts with Rome. The remnants of Scythian civilization, though greatly diminished from their former glory, still maintained important settlements and cultural traditions in the Black Sea region. Scythian knowledge of local geography, trade routes, and diplomatic practices proved valuable to Gothic newcomers seeking to establish themselves in unfamiliar territory. The famous Scythian gold-working traditions influenced Gothic decorative arts, while Scythian agricultural techniques adapted to steppe conditions provided models for Gothic farming communities. Germanic peoples beyond the Goths also participated in the migration into the Pontic region. The Gepids, closely related to the Goths linguistically and culturally, established settlements in the Carpathian Basin and maintained complex relationships with their Gothic neighbours. The Heruli, another Germanic group, occupied territories along the northern Black Sea coast and developed a reputation as skilled seafarers and raiders. These various Germanic populations created a network of related but independent political entities that would cooperate and compete throughout the migration period. The emergence of powerful Gothic chieftains during this period reflects the challenges of governing diverse populations across extensive territories. Archaeological evidence from elite burials reveals individuals of extraordinary wealth and status, buried with elaborate weapons, jewellery, and imported luxury goods that demonstrate their participation in international trade networks. The burial at Conquests in Romania contained a warrior interred with a gold-hilted sword, silver belt fittings, and Roman coins, indicating both military leadership and diplomatic connections. Gothic political structures evolved to accommodate the realities of ruling settled agricultural communities alongside pastoral nomadic groups. The traditional Germanic assembly system adapted to include representatives from various tribal groups, creating a more complex but flexible form of governance. Kings and chieftains derived authority from military success, but also needed to demonstrate skill in managing agricultural production, trade relationships, and diplomatic negotiations with neighbouring powers. The development of territorial kingdoms marked a significant departure from earlier Germanic political organisation. Gothic rulers began claiming authority over specific geographical regions, rather than simply leading mobile tribal groups. This territorialization required new forms of administration, including the appointment of local governors, the establishment of tribute systems, and the creation of permanent military garrisons to defend borders and maintain internal order. Religious practices within Gothic territories reflected the multicultural nature of Cherniakov society. Traditional Germanic paganism continued to dominate, but incorporated elements from Sarmatian and Scythian religious traditions. Archaeological evidence reveals ritual deposits combining Germanic weapon sacrifices with Sarmatian horse burials and Scythian animal-style decorative elements. The syncretistic nature of these practices demonstrates the cultural flexibility that enabled Gothic communities to integrate diverse populations while maintaining their distinctive identity. The economic foundation of Gothic settlement in the Pontic region rested on a combination of agriculture, pastoralism, and trade. The fertile black earth soils of Ukraine provided ideal conditions for grain cultivation, while the extensive grassland supported large herds of cattle and horses. Gothic communities developed sophisticated systems for managing these resources, including seasonal migration patterns for livestock and crop rotation techniques that maintained soil fertility. Trade relationships connected Gothic territories with markets throughout Europe and beyond. Amber from the Baltic continued to flow southward, through Gothic intermediaries, while Roman luxury goods moved northward in exchange for furs, slaves, and agricultural products. The discovery of Roman coins in Gothic settlements demonstrates the extent of these commercial relationships, with some hoards containing thousands of denarii and aurei spanning several centuries of Roman minting. The strategic position of Gothic territories along the Dnieper River provided access to the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks that would later become crucial for medieval trade between Scandinavia and Byzantium. Gothic control of key river crossings and portage points enabled them to extract tribute from merchant caravans while participating directly in long-distance commerce. This economic advantage contributed significantly to the wealth and power of Gothic rulers. Initial contacts between Gothic communities and the Roman Empire occurred through multiple channels during the 3rd century. Roman merchants had long operated in the Black Sea region, establishing trading posts and maintaining diplomatic relationships with local rulers. The arrival of Gothic populations disrupted these established patterns, but also created new opportunities for commercial exchange. Border skirmishes along the Danube frontier began as Gothic populations expanded southward and encountered Roman defensive positions. These early conflicts typically involved small-scale raids and cattle rustling rather than major military campaigns. Roman frontier troops stationed in fortified positions along the river initially viewed Gothic activities as manageable security challenges rather than existential threats to imperial stability. Diplomatic contacts developed as Gothic chieftains sought to establish formal relationships with Roman authorities. The exchange of embassies became routine, with Gothic leaders sending representatives to negotiate trade agreements, resolve border disputes, and sometimes request military assistance against rival tribes. These diplomatic interactions introduced Gothic elites to Roman political practices and provided opportunities for cultural exchange that would influence Gothic development for generations. The transformation of Gothic society during their settlement in the Pontic region created the foundation for their later emergence as a major force in European politics. The combination of traditional Germanic military culture with steppe warfare techniques, agricultural prosperity, and extensive trade networks produced a powerful and adaptable civilization capable of challenging Roman supremacy. The multicultural nature of Gothic territories fostered innovation and flexibility, while maintaining the distinctive identity that would define Gothic peoples throughout their subsequent history. The prosperity and territorial expansion achieved by Gothic communities in the Pontic-Caspian steppe during the 3rd century contained within it the seeds of a fundamental transformation that would reshape the entire Gothic world. As populations grew and territories expanded across the vast expanse from the Dniester River to the Don, the practical challenges of governing such extensive domains began to strain traditional Germanic political structures. The sheer geographical scale of Gothic settlement, combined with the diverse populations they had incorporated and the varying environmental conditions across their territories, created pressures that would ultimately lead to the emergence of 2 distinct Gothic confederations. The Dniester River gradually evolved into more than a geographical feature dividing Gothic territories. It became a cultural and political boundary that would define the future of the Gothic peoples. West of this river, in the regions encompassing modern-day Moldova, eastern Romania, and parts of Ukraine, the Turingi Confederation consolidated control over territories that favoured mixed agricultural and pastoral economies. The fertile valleys and rolling hills of this region supported dense populations of farmers and herders, while the proximity to the Carpathian Mountains provided natural defensive barriers and access to mineral resources. East of the Dniester, the Greuthungi Confederation dominated the open steppes stretching toward the Don River, territories that favoured large-scale pastoralism and offered direct access to the lucrative trade routes connecting the Black Sea with Central Asia. The environmental differences between these regions profoundly influenced the development of distinct economic systems, social structures, and political organisations that would characterise the two Gothic groups for centuries to come. The Tervingi developed a more centralised political structure adapted to governing settled agricultural communities. Their territories contained numerous fortified settlements, some built on elevated positions overlooking river valleys, others constructed around natural springs or strategic crossroads. Archaeological excavations at sites like Brangstrup and Tagsor reveal substantial defensive earthworks, wooden palisades, and stone foundations that indicate permanent settlement patterns requiring coordinated construction efforts and ongoing maintenance. The leadership structure among the Tervingi reflected the needs of territorial governance. Kings and chieftains established courts at fixed locations, typically fortified settlements that served as administrative centres for surrounding agricultural districts. These courts attracted skilled craftsmen, merchants and warriors who formed the nucleus of an emerging aristocratic class. The concentration of wealth and power in specific locations facilitated the development of more sophisticated governmental institutions, including systems for collecting tribute, administering justice, and organising military campaigns. Archaeological evidence from Tervingi burial sites demonstrates the emergence of a highly stratified society, with clear distinctions between social classes. Elite graves contain elaborate grave goods, including silver-inlaid weapons, gold jewellery featuring intricate animal designs, and imported luxury items such as Roman glass vessels and silk textiles. The famous princely burial at Conquests contained a warrior interred with a gold-hilted spatha, silver belt fittings decorated with garnets, and a complete set of riding equipment including silver-mounted bridle components and decorative horse harness elements. The Greuthungi Confederation, operating in the open steppes east of the Dniester, developed markedly different political and social institutions adapted to their more mobile lifestyle. Their territories lacked the natural defensive barriers that characterised their Tervingi lands, requiring different military strategies and political structures. The Greuthungi maintained larger cavalry forces and developed more flexible command structures that could coordinate the movements of dispersed tribal groups across vast distances. Greuthungi settlements typically consisted of smaller, more dispersed communities that could be relocated as needed to follow seasonal grazing patterns or respond to military threats. Archaeological evidence suggests that Greuthungi populations maintained greater mobility than their Western counterparts, with settlements showing less permanent construction and more portable material culture. The emphasis on mobility influenced everything from housing construction to craft production, with Greuthungi artisans specialising in portable luxury items rather than monumental architecture. The political organisation of the Greuthungi reflected their pastoral economy and mobile lifestyle. Leadership remained more decentralised, with multiple chieftains controlling different tribal segments and coordinating their activities through councils and assemblies. The famous King Alaric, who would later rule a vast confederation stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, exemplified this type of leadership, commanding loyalty through military success and diplomatic skill rather than control over fixed territories. The economic foundations of the two Gothic confederations created distinct patterns of trade and resource utilisation. The Tervingi, with their agricultural surplus and strategic position along Danubian trade routes, developed extensive commercial relationships with Roman merchants and provincial administrators. Their territories produced grain, livestock, and craft goods that found ready markets in Roman cities, while Roman luxury items, wine, and manufactured goods flowed northward in exchange. Tervingi craftsmen achieved remarkable sophistication in metalworking, particularly in the production of silver jewellery and decorative weapons. The workshops at sites like Pietrasle produced elaborate fibulae featuring intricate animal interlace patterns, garnet inlays, and sophisticated granulation techniques that rivaled the finest Roman goldsmith work. These luxury items served both practical and symbolic functions, displaying the wealth and status of their owners while reinforcing cultural identity through distinctive Gothic artistic styles. The Greuthungi economy centred on large-scale pastoralism combined with long-distance trade. The herds of cattle, sheep, and horses provided the foundation for both subsistence and commercial activities. Greuthungi merchants operated along the trade routes connecting the Black Sea with Central Asian markets, dealing in furs, amber, slaves, and livestock. The mobility of Greuthungi populations gave them advantages in accessing seasonal markets and avoiding the taxes and restrictions that affected settled merchants. Horsebreeding became a particular specialty of the Greuthungi, who developed strains of cavalry mounts prized throughout Europe for their speed, endurance, and fighting ability. Archaeological evidence from Greuthungi burial sites reveals elaborate horse harnesses, bits, and saddle fittings that demonstrate the central importance of mounted warfare in their military culture. The integration of Sarmatian heavy cavalry techniques with Germanic warrior traditions produced a distinctive fighting style that would influence European warfare for centuries. The religious and cultural differences between the two Gothic confederations reflected their distinct political and economic development. The Tervingi, with their more settled lifestyle and closer contacts with Roman civilization, began incorporating Mediterranean influences into their traditional Germanic religious practices. Archaeological evidence reveals ritual deposits that combine traditional weapon sacrifices with Roman-style votive offerings, suggesting the emergence of syncretic religious practices. Tervingi burial customs evolved to reflect their increasingly hierarchical society. Elite graves became more elaborate, with some containing multiple individuals buried with extensive grave goods, including complete sets of weapons, jewellery, and household items. The practice of constructing stone-lined burial chambers, previously uncommon among Germanic peoples, appeared in Tervingi territories during this period, possibly influenced by contact with Roman provincial populations. The Greuthungi maintained more traditional Germanic religious practices, with their mobile lifestyle limiting the development of permanent cult sites and elaborate ritual complexes. Their religious observances emphasized portable, sacred objects and seasonal ceremonies that could be performed regardless of location. The famous golden arm rings found in Greuthungi burials served both as status symbols and religious objects, with some featuring runic inscriptions invoking divine protection. Linguistic developments within the two confederations began to diverge during this period of separation. While both groups continued to speak dialects of East Germanic that remained mutually intelligible, regional variations in vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar began to emerge. The Tervingi incorporated more Latin loanwords, reflecting their extensive contacts with Roman populations, while the Greuthungi adopted terms from Sarmatian and other steppe languages encountered in their eastern territories. The preservation of Gothic linguistic materials from this period remains fragmentary, but comparative analysis of later sources suggests that significant dialectal differences had developed by the 4th century. The Tervingi dialect, which would later be preserved in Wulfila's biblical translation, shows influences from Latin and Thracian languages, while reconstructed Greuthungi vocabulary includes terms related to steppe warfare and pastoralism that reflects their distinct cultural environment. The military organization of the two confederations reflected their different territorial and economic foundations. The Tervingi developed a more structured military hierarchy, with specialized units for different types of warfare. Their infantry forces, equipped with spears, shields, and short swords, excelled in defensive operations and siege warfare. The construction of fortified settlements required coordinated engineering efforts and permanent garrisons, leading to the development of professional military classes. The Vingi cavalry units, while smaller than those of their eastern cousins, specialized in coordinated operations with infantry forces. Their horsemen typically fought as mounted spearmen, using their mobility to exploit weaknesses in enemy formations while maintaining the ability to dismount and fight on foot when necessary. The integration of Sarmatian armoured cavalry techniques with Germanic warrior traditions produced a balanced military system capable of both offensive and defensive operations. The Greuthungi military organisation emphasised mobility and flexibility above all else. Their armies consisted primarily of cavalry units organised around tribal groups, with each chieftain commanding his own followers and contributing to larger Confederate forces as needed. The Greuthungi developed sophisticated scouting and communication systems that enabled them to coordinate the movements of dispersed forces across vast territories. The arrival of Hunnic peoples in the Pontic-Caspian region during the mid-4th century created unprecedented challenges for both Gothic confederations. The Huns, emerging from the Central Asian steppes with military technologies and tactical systems previously unknown in Europe, possessed advantages in mobility, archery, and siege warfare that disrupted established patterns of steppe politics. The Hunnic military system combined the traditional steppe emphasis on mounted archery with innovative tactical formations and siege techniques acquired through contact with Chinese and Persian civilizations. Hunnic composite bows, constructed from horn, wood, and sinew, achieved ranges and penetrating power that exceeded anything available to Gothic warriors. The Hunnic practice of coordinating multiple cavalry armies across vast distances through sophisticated communication systems enabled them to concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points. The initial Hunnic attacks targeted the Greuthungi Confederation, whose eastern territories bore the brunt of the invasion. The open steppes that had provided the Greuthungi with mobility and access to trade routes now became avenues for Hunnic advance. The speed and coordination of Hunnic attacks overwhelmed traditional Gothic defensive strategies, forcing Greuthungi populations to abandon their territories and seek refuge in more defensible locations. The collapse of Greuthungi resistance under Hunnic pressure created a refugee crisis that affected the entire Gothic world. Displaced populations fled westward, seeking shelter in Thervingi territories and creating unprecedented demographic pressures. The influx of refugees strained resources and created political tensions, as established communities struggled to accommodate newcomers while maintaining their own security. The Thervingi Confederation faced difficult choices as Hunnic forces advanced westward. Their more centralised political structure enabled coordinated resistance efforts, but their settled populations and fixed fortifications made strategic withdrawal more difficult than it had been for the mobile Greuthungi. The decision to seek Roman protection by crossing the Danube represented a fundamental shift in Gothic strategy, abandoning their hard-won territories in favour of survival. The Hunnic invasions accelerated the division between the two Gothic confederations by forcing them to pursue different survival strategies. The Thervingi, maintaining greater political cohesion under their king Fritigern, negotiated their entry into Roman territory as a unified group. The Greuthungi, scattered by the initial Hunnic attacks, fragmented into smaller groups that would follow different paths through the chaos of the migration period. The religious implications of the Hunnic invasions affected both Gothic confederations, but in different ways. The Thervingi, already exposed to Christian influences through their contacts with Roman civilization, began to see Christianity as a potential source of divine protection against pagan enemies. The conversion of significant portions of the Thervingi population to Arian Christianity during this period reflected both practical political considerations and genuine religious conviction. The Greuthungi, scattered and displaced by the Hunnic invasions, maintained their traditional religious practices while adapting to new circumstances. Some Greuthungi groups eventually accepted Hunnic overlordship and integrated into the expanding Hunnic Confederation, while others maintained their independence through constant warfare and migration. These different responses to religious and political challenges would influence the development of Gothic culture for generations to come. The linguistic consequences of the Hunnic invasions included the adoption of Hunnic military terminology, and administrative vocabulary by Gothic speakers. Terms related to siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and political organisation entered Gothic dialects through contact with Hunnic populations. The fragmentation of Gothic communities also accelerated the development of regional linguistic variations, as separated populations adapted to different environments and influences. The material culture of both Gothic confederations underwent significant changes during the period of Hunnic invasions. Traditional Gothic metalworking techniques adapted to incorporate Hunnic decorative motifs and weapon designs. The famous polychrome jewellery style, featuring gold settings with garnet and other coloured stone inlays, emerged from this cultural synthesis and would become characteristic of Gothic artistic production throughout the migration period. The transformation of Gothic society during their settlement in the Pontic-Caspian steppe had created a formidable confederation of tribes whose military capabilities and territorial ambitions would soon collide with the Roman Empire's northern frontier. By the 230 SAD, Gothic populations had consolidated control over vast territories stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the Sea of Azov, establishing a power base that rivaled any barbarian confederation Rome had previously encountered. The prosperity derived from their agricultural settlements, extensive trade networks, and integration of diverse tribal groups had produced a military machine capable of sustained campaigns against the world's most powerful empire. The first major Gothic incursion into Roman territory occurred in 238 AD under circumstances that revealed both the opportunistic nature of Gothic leadership and the empire's growing vulnerability along its extended frontiers. Emperor Maximinus Thrax had withdrawn substantial military forces from the Danubian frontier to support his campaigns in Germany, leaving the river defences undermanned and poorly coordinated. Gothic scouts, maintaining constant surveillance of Roman military movements through their extensive intelligence networks, recognised this weakness and moved quickly to exploit it. The initial Gothic crossing of the Danube involved approximately 3,000 warriors organised into multiple war bands, each led by experienced chieftains who had proven themselves in previous raids against Sarmatian and Dacian settlements. These forces demonstrated remarkable coordination for what appeared to be independent tribal groups, suggesting the existence of a unified command structure capable of planning and executing complex military operations. The Goths crossed the river at multiple points simultaneously, overwhelming the scattered Roman garrison forces and establishing bridgeheads on the southern bank before imperial reinforcements could respond effectively. The Gothic advance into Moesia Superia revealed tactical innovations that would characterise their military operations for the next 3 decades. Rather than engaging in the traditional barbarian pattern of quick raids followed by immediate withdrawal, the Goths established fortified camps in Roman territory and began systematic exploitation of the province's resources. They constructed earthwork fortifications using techniques learned from Roman prisoners and deserters, creating defensive positions that could withstand counterattacks while serving as bases for further operations. The Siege of Histria in 238 AD demonstrated Gothic capabilities in organised warfare that surprised Roman commanders accustomed to dealing with less sophisticated barbarian opponents. The Goths employed siege engines constructed from local timber, including battering rams and scaling ladders that enabled them to assault the city's walls directly. More significantly, they demonstrated patience and logistical planning by maintaining their siege for several months, indicating their ability to supply large forces in enemy territory for extended periods. Roman defensive responses during this initial phase proved inadequate due to the empire's preoccupation with internal conflicts and the Persian threat in the east. The available frontier forces, consisting primarily of auxiliary units and local militias, lacked the training and equipment necessary to confront the well-organised Gothic armies. The Roman reliance on fixed fortifications along the Danube, designed to prevent small-scale raids rather than major invasions, proved ineffective against Gothic forces capable of bypassing strongpoints and operating in the empire's interior. The Gothic withdrawal from this first major incursion occurred not due to Roman military pressure, but because of developments in their homeland territories. Sarmatian tribes, taking advantage of Gothic absence, had launched attacks against Gothic settlements east of the Dniester River, forcing the warbands to return and defend their families and livestock. This pattern of Gothic expansion, limited by homeland security concerns, would characterize many of their early campaigns against Rome. The decade following the first Gothic incursion witnessed escalating tensions along the Danubian frontier, as both sides prepared for renewed conflict. The Goths used this period to consolidate their territorial gains, integrate captured Roman military equipment and techniques, and recruit additional tribal groups for future campaigns. Archaeological evidence from Gothic settlements during this period reveals increased production of iron weapons, the construction of larger fortified centres, and the accumulation of Roman coins and precious metals that would finance future military operations. Roman preparations under Emperor Gordian III included the reconstruction of Danubian fortifications, the establishment of new military bases, and attempts to create diplomatic alliances with Gothic rivals. The Romans invested heavily in intelligence gathering, employing Gothic deserters and prisoners to provide information about tribal politics and military capabilities. These efforts revealed the extent of Gothic territorial control and the sophisticated nature of their political organisation, information that would prove crucial in subsequent conflicts. The resumption of major Gothic warfare in 248 AD coincided with the celebration of Rome's millennium, creating a symbolic challenge to imperial prestige that demanded vigorous response. The Gothic Confederation had grown substantially during the previous decade, incorporating Sarmatian cavalry units, Dacian remnants, and various Germanic tribes into a military alliance capable of fielding armies exceeding 20,000 warriors. This force represented the largest barbarian army Rome had faced since the Cimbrian and Teutonic invasions 3 centuries earlier. The Gothic strategy for this renewed campaign demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Roman military capabilities and political weaknesses. Rather than attempting to hold Roman territory permanently, the Goths planned a series of coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm Roman defensive capabilities while extracting maximum plunder and prisoners. Their forces divided into multiple columns that could operate independently while maintaining communication and mutual support, a tactical innovation that would influence barbarian warfare throughout the migration period. The siege of Philippopolis in 249 AD marked a turning point in Gothic military capabilities and Roman defensive strategy. The city, located in the heart of Thrace and serving as a major administrative centre, presented formidable defensive challenges that required Gothic forces to develop new siege techniques. The Goths constructed elaborate earthworks surrounding the city, including trenches, palisades, and siege towers that demonstrated their ability to conduct complex engineering operations. The Gothic siege lines at Philippopolis extended for several kilometres and included multiple fortified camps connected by communication trenches. These installations required thousands of workers and sophisticated logistical planning to maintain, indicating the presence of skilled engineers and experienced military administrators within Gothic ranks. The siege works incorporated captured Roman military equipment, including artillery pieces and siege engines operated by Roman prisoners who had been pressed into Gothic service. The defence of Philippopolis revealed the limitations of Roman urban fortifications when confronted by determined and well-equipped besiegers. The city's walls, constructed during the 2nd century AD, had been designed to withstand traditional barbarian raids rather than systematic siege operations. The Gothic employment of undermining techniques, combined with their ability to construct effective siege towers and battering rams, gradually weakened the city's defences despite the determined resistance of its garrison and civilian population. The fall of Philippopolis after a siege lasting several months provided the Goths with enormous quantities of plunder, including gold, silver, precious stones, and luxury goods that would finance their military operations for years to come. More importantly, the victory demonstrated Gothic capabilities to other barbarian tribes and encouraged additional groups to join their confederation. The psychological impact on Roman morale was equally significant, as news of the city's fall spread throughout the empire and contributed to growing concerns about frontier security. The Battle of Abritus in 251 AD represented the climax of early Gothic military success against Rome and demonstrated the tactical innovations that made Gothic armies so formidable. Emperor Decius, determined to restore Roman prestige and eliminate the Gothic threat, assembled a substantial army including elements of the Praetorian Guard, Danubian legions, and auxiliary forces drawn from across the empire. This force, numbering approximately 15,000 men, represented one of the largest Roman armies deployed against barbarian opponents during the 3rd century. The Gothic army that faced Decius at Abritus had evolved significantly from the tribal warbands that had first crossed the Danube 13 years earlier. The core of Gothic strength consisted of heavily armed infantry organised into disciplined formations capable of sustained combat against Roman legionaries. These warriors carried long spears, oval shields, and single-edged swords, while their leaders wore mail armour and helmets that provided protection comparable to Roman equipment. The Gothic cavalry component at Abritus included both traditional Germanic horsemen and Sarmatian heavy cavalry units that had been integrated into the Gothic Confederation. The Sarmatian cataphracts, armoured in scale mail and carrying long lances, provided the Goths with shock capabilities that could break Roman infantry formations. The coordination between Gothic infantry and cavalry demonstrated tactical sophistication that rivaled Roman military doctrine. The battlefield at Abritus, located in the marshy terrain near modern Razgrad in Bulgaria, favoured Gothic tactical preferences while limiting Roman advantages in organisation and equipment. The Goths had chosen their position carefully, occupying elevated ground that provided defensive advantages while channeling Roman attacks into predetermined killing zones. The marshy approaches to Gothic positions would bog down Roman heavy infantry and limit their ability to maintain formation integrity. The battle opened with Gothic archers and javelin throwers harassing Roman formations as they advanced across the difficult terrain. These missile troops, drawn from various tribal groups within the Gothic Confederation, maintained constant pressure on Roman ranks while avoiding direct engagement. The Gothic use of combined arms tactics, coordinating archery with cavalry charges and infantry assaults, demonstrated military sophistication that surprised Roman commanders. The decisive moment of the battle came when Gothic cavalry, led by Sarmatian cataphracts, charged the Roman left flank while it was struggling through marshy ground. The impact of armoured horsemen against disordered Roman infantry created a breach in the imperial line that Gothic foot soldiers quickly exploited. The collapse of Roman formation integrity led to widespread panic as individual units found themselves surrounded and cut off from mutual support. Emperor Decius died during the confused fighting that followed the Gothic breakthrough, struck down while attempting to rally his collapsing forces. The death of a reigning emperor in battle represented an unprecedented disaster for Roman prestige and demonstrated the extent of Gothic military capabilities. The loss of imperial leadership completed the disintegration of Roman resistance, allowing Gothic forces to overwhelm the remaining pockets of organised defence. The aftermath of Abritus provided the Goths with their greatest victory against Rome and established their reputation as the most formidable barbarian opponents the empire faced. The capture of imperial standards, military equipment, and thousands of Roman prisoners provided both material and psychological advantages that would influence Gothic strategy for decades. The victory also attracted additional tribal groups to the Gothic Confederation, swelling their ranks with warriors eager to share in future successes against Rome. The Roman response to the disaster at Abritus required fundamental changes in imperial military strategy and frontier defence policy. The traditional system of linear frontier defence, based on fortified positions along the Danube, had proven inadequate against Gothic forces capable of concentrating overwhelming strength at specific points. The death of an emperor in battle demonstrated the personal risks involved in confronting Gothic armies and influenced subsequent imperial decisions about direct military involvement. Emperor Trebonianus Gallus, who succeeded Decius, initially attempted to negotiate with the Goths rather than risk additional military disasters. The resulting treaty provided the Goths with annual payments in gold and silver, effectively acknowledging their military superiority and legitimizing their territorial gains. This diplomatic solution, while temporarily ending Gothic raids, established a precedent for imperial weakness that would encourage further barbarian demands. The Gothic territorial gains following Abritus included control of much of Thrace and portions of Moesia, creating a barbarian-controlled enclave within the Roman Empire. Gothic settlements in these territories demonstrated their intention to establish permanent control rather than simply extracting plunder. The construction of fortified centres and the establishment of agricultural communities indicated Gothic confidence in their ability to maintain their conquests against future Roman attempts at reconquest. The integration of Roman prisoners and deserters into Gothic society accelerated during this period of military success. Roman engineers, craftsmen, and military specialists provided the Goths with technical knowledge that enhanced their capabilities in siege warfare, fortification construction, and weapons production. The presence of Roman advisors within Gothic councils influenced their strategic planning and diplomatic negotiations with the empire. The Gothic adoption of Roman military equipment and techniques created hybrid forces that combined barbarian mobility and aggression with Roman discipline and organisation. Gothic warriors began wearing Roman-style armour and carrying Roman weapons while maintaining their traditional tactical preferences and command structures. This synthesis of military traditions produced armies that were both familiar and alien to Roman commanders, complicating imperial defensive planning. The period between 251 and 260 AD witnessed continued Gothic expansion and the development of new military capabilities that would challenge Roman control throughout the Balkans. The Goths began constructing and operating naval vessels, enabling them to launch seaborne raids against Roman cities along the Black Sea coast. These maritime operations demonstrated Gothic adaptability and their ability to exploit Roman weaknesses in unexpected ways. The Gothic naval campaigns revealed the extent of their territorial control and the sophistication of their logistical capabilities. The construction of warships required access to timber, iron, and skilled craftsmen, while naval operations demanded knowledge of navigation, seamanship, and coastal geography. The Gothic ability to coordinate land and sea operations indicated the presence of unified command structures capable of managing complex military campaigns across multiple theatres. The devastating defeat of Emperor Decius at Abritus in 251 AD marked not merely a military catastrophe, but a profound transformation in the relationship between the Gothic peoples and the Roman Empire. As Gothic warriors celebrated their unprecedented victory over imperial forces, the seeds of an even more significant change were already taking root within their own society. The capture of thousands of Roman prisoners, including soldiers, administrators, and civilians, brought Gothic communities into direct contact with Roman religious practices and beliefs that would ultimately reshape their entire civilization. Among the Roman captives taken during the Gothic campaigns of the 250s were numerous Christians, whose presence in Gothic settlements introduced theological concepts that would prove more transformative than any military victory. These Christian prisoners, drawn from various social backgrounds and representing different regional traditions within the early church, found themselves in the unique position of practicing their faith among pagan captors who displayed surprising tolerance for religious diversity. The Gothic tradition of incorporating useful elements from conquered peoples, extended to religious practices, creating an environment where Christian beliefs could take root and flourish. The most significant figure to emerge from this period of religious transformation was Ulfilas, whose Gothic name Wulfila means little wolf, and whose remarkable career would bridge the gap between Gothic paganism and Christian faith. Born around 311 AD to a Gothic father and a Cappadocian mother who had been captured during earlier raids, Ulfilas embodied the cultural synthesis that characterized Gothic society during this period. His mixed heritage provided him with fluency in both Gothic and Greek, while his upbringing in a Christian household gave him intimate knowledge of biblical texts and theological concepts. The circumstances of Ulfilas' early life reflect the complex social dynamics within Gothic communities during the mid-4th century. His mother's status as a Roman captive did not prevent her from maintaining her Christian faith or passing it on to her son, indicating a level of religious tolerance that contrasted sharply with Roman persecution of Christianity during the same period. The Gothic practice of adopting useful skills and knowledge from captive populations meant that Christian learning was valued alongside traditional crafts and military techniques. Ulfilas' education combined traditional Gothic cultural training with Christian theological instruction, creating a unique synthesis that would prove crucial for his later missionary work. He learned the oral traditions of Gothic history and law, mastered the skills of reading and writing in Greek and Latin, and studied Christian scriptures with the intensity of a dedicated theologian. This comprehensive education prepared him for the challenging task of translating complex theological concepts into a language that had previously existed only in oral form. The development of Gothic Christianity during this period occurred within the broader context of theological controversies that were reshaping the Roman Christian Church. The Arian controversy, which had erupted in Alexandria during the 310s and continued to divide Christian communities throughout the empire, reached Gothic territories through the testimony of Christian captives and the missionary activities of Arian clergy. The theological positions associated with Arianism, particularly its emphasis on the subordination of the Son to the Father and its rejection of the Nicene formulation of the Trinity, found receptive audiences among Gothic converts. The appeal of Arian Christianity to Gothic populations stemmed from several factors that reflected both theological considerations and practical political calculations. The Arian emphasis on the unity and supremacy of God the Father resonated with Germanic religious traditions that emphasized the authority of divine kings and the hierarchical nature of spiritual power. The Arian rejection of the Nicene concept of homoousios, same substance, avoided theological complexities that might have proven difficult to translate into Gothic cultural concepts. More significantly, the adoption of Arian Christianity provided Gothic leaders with a religious identity that distinguished them from their Roman enemies while maintaining connections to the broader Christian world. The Roman Empire's official endorsement of Nicene Christianity after the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD meant that Gothic adherence to Arianism represented both religious conviction and political independence. This theological distinction would influence Gothic-Roman relations for centuries and contribute to the persistence of Arian beliefs among Germanic peoples long after their establishment within Roman territories. Ulfilas' ordination as a bishop around 341 AD marked the beginning of systematic Christian missionary activity among the Gothic peoples. His consecration by Eusebius of Nicomedia, a prominent Arian theologian, established the theological orientation that would characterize Gothic Christianity and connected the Gothic Church to the broader Arian movement within the Roman Empire. The support of Arian bishops provided Ulfilas with access to theological resources and institutional backing that proved crucial for his missionary success. The missionary methods employed by Ulfilas demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Gothic culture and the challenges of religious conversion among tribal societies. Rather than attempting to impose Roman Christian practices wholesale, he adapted Christian teachings to Gothic cultural contexts while maintaining essential theological content. His approach emphasized the continuity between Germanic concepts of divine authority and Christian monotheism, presenting Christianity as the fulfillment of traditional Gothic religious aspirations rather than their replacement. The translation of Christian scriptures into the Gothic language represented Ulfilas's most enduring contribution to both Gothic culture and the broader history of Christianity. This monumental undertaking required not only linguistic expertise, but also the creation of an entirely new writing system, capable of representing Gothic phonemes and grammatical structures. The Gothic alphabet developed by Ulfilas combined elements from Greek, Latin, and runic scripts, creating a unique writing system that reflected the multicultural influences within Gothic society. The Gothic alphabet consisted of 27 letters, each carefully chosen to represent specific sounds in the Gothic language, while maintaining visual connections to familiar writing systems. The majority of letters derived from Greek uncial script, reflecting Ulfilas's theological education and the Greek origins of the Christian texts he was translating. Several letters borrowed from Latin script provided representations for sounds that did not exist in Greek, while a few symbols adapted from runic traditions maintained connections to Germanic writing practices. The process of biblical translation into Gothic required Ulfilas to make numerous decisions about theological terminology and cultural adaptation that would influence Gothic Christianity for generations. The translation of key theological concepts such as logos, word, pneuma, spirit, and ecclesia, church, required careful consideration of Gothic vocabulary and cultural associations. Ulfilas's choices in these matters reflected both his theological training and his intimate knowledge of Gothic society. The Gothic term word, chosen to translate logos, maintained the theological significance of the Greek original, while connecting to Gothic concepts of authoritative speech and divine command. The translation of pneuma as ahma, breath spirit, drew on Germanic spiritual traditions that associated divine power with life-giving breath. These translation choices demonstrate Ulfilas's skill in bridging theological concepts across cultural boundaries while maintaining doctrinal integrity. The surviving fragments of Ulfilas's Gothic Bible, preserved primarily in the 6th century Codex Argentius, housed in Uppsala University, provide invaluable insights into both Gothic language and early Christian theology. The manuscript, written in silver and gold ink on purple parchment, reflects the high status accorded to Christian texts within Gothic society and demonstrates the sophisticated book production capabilities of Gothic scriptoriums. The Gothic text reveals a translation that maintains remarkable fidelity to Greek originals, while adapting to Gothic grammatical structures and cultural concepts. The theological implications of Gothic adoption of Arian Christianity extended far beyond simple religious conversion to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between Germanic peoples and Roman civilization. The Arian emphasis on the Father's supremacy and the Son's subordination provided theological justification for Gothic political independence, while maintaining Christian identity. This theological position enabled Gothic rulers to claim divine sanction for their authority, while rejecting Roman imperial claims to universal dominion. The development of Gothic Christian culture during the 4th century created new forms of artistic expression that combined traditional Germanic motifs with Christian symbolism. Gothic metalworkers began incorporating Christian symbols into their traditional animal-style decorations, creating hybrid artistic traditions that reflected the synthesis of pagan and Christian elements within Gothic society. The famous Pietra-Ursel treasure includes several pieces that demonstrate this cultural fusion, featuring Christian inscriptions alongside traditional Germanic decorative elements. Gothic Christian architecture evolved from the practical needs of congregational worship within communities that had previously conducted religious ceremonies in natural settings or temporary structures. The construction of permanent church buildings required adaptation of Roman architectural principles to Gothic building traditions and available materials. Archaeological evidence from Gothic settlements reveals church structures that combined Roman basilica plans with Germanic construction techniques, creating distinctive architectural forms that reflected the cultural synthesis of Gothic Christianity. The literary traditions that emerged from Gothic Christian culture represented a significant departure from the oral traditions that had previously dominated Germanic cultural transmission. The creation of written Gothic literature, beginning with Ulfilas's biblical translation, established new forms of cultural expression that would influence Germanic literary development for centuries. The Gothic Bible provided a model for written composition that inspired the creation of additional Christian texts, including hymns, prayers, and theological treatises. The influence of Christianity on Gothic political organisation manifested in several important ways that transformed traditional Germanic governmental structures. The Christian emphasis on divine authority and moral law provided new sources of legitimacy for Gothic rulers, while introducing concepts of justice and governance that complemented traditional Germanic legal practices. The integration of Christian clergy into Gothic political structures created new institutional frameworks for administration and dispute resolution. Gothic legal codes began incorporating Christian moral principles alongside traditional Germanic legal concepts, creating hybrid legal systems that reflected the religious transformation of Gothic society. The Christian emphasis on mercy and forgiveness modified traditional Germanic practices of blood revenge and compensation, while Christian concepts of divine judgment influenced procedures for determining guilt and innocence. These legal innovations would prove influential in the development of early medieval European law. The social structures of Gothic communities underwent significant modifications as Christian teachings about human dignity and spiritual equality challenged traditional Germanic hierarchies. While Gothic society remained fundamentally stratified, Christian concepts of spiritual brotherhood and divine concern for the poor created new obligations for elite members and new opportunities for social mobility. The Christian Church provided alternative paths to status and influence that complemented traditional military and political routes to power. The role of Christian clergy within Gothic society extended beyond purely religious functions to encompass educational, administrative, and diplomatic responsibilities. Gothic bishops and priests served as advisors to secular rulers, administrators of charitable institutions, and intermediaries in negotiations with Roman authorities. The literacy and theological training of Christian clergy made them valuable resources for Gothic communities seeking to navigate the complex political and cultural challenges of the late imperial period. The persistence of Arian Christianity among Gothic peoples throughout the migration period reflected both theological conviction and political necessity. The theological differences between Arian and Nicene Christianity became markers of ethnic and political identity that distinguished Gothic communities from Roman populations. The maintenance of Arian beliefs provided Gothic rulers with religious justification for their independence while creating barriers to full integration with Roman society. The missionary activities of Gothic Christians extended beyond their own communities to influence other Germanic peoples and contribute to the broader Christianization of Europe. Gothic missionaries carried Arian Christianity to the Vandals, Burgundians, and other Germanic tribes, creating networks of religious and cultural connection that transcended political boundaries. The Gothic example of successful Christian conversion while maintaining political independence provided models for other Germanic peoples facing similar challenges. The theological controversies surrounding Arian Christianity continue to influence Gothic-Roman relations throughout the 5th and 6th centuries, creating religious barriers to political cooperation and cultural integration. The Roman insistence on Nicene orthodoxy as a prerequisite for full acceptance within the empire meant that Gothic adherence to Arianism remained a source of tension even after Gothic establishment within Roman territories. These religious differences would contribute to the eventual absorption of Gothic populations into the broader European Christian community, while leaving lasting influences on medieval theology and culture. The tranquil prosperity that had characterized Gothic territories in the Pontic-Caspian steppe for over a century came to an abrupt and violent end during the 370 SAD, with the arrival of a nomadic confederation whose military capabilities and ruthless efficiency would reshape the entire political landscape of Eastern Europe. The Huns, emerging from the vast steppes of Central Asia, with a warrior culture honed by generations of conflict against Chinese and Persian civilizations, brought with them military technologies and tactical innovations that rendered traditional Gothic defensive strategies obsolete. Their composite bows, capable of penetrating armour at ranges exceeding 300 metres, combined with their unmatched mobility and coordination of multiple cavalry armies, created a military machine unlike anything European peoples had previously encountered. The first reports of Hunnic presence reached Gothic settlements through terrified refugees fleeing from territories east of the Don River, where Alanic tribes had maintained control for centuries. These initial accounts, dismissed by many Gothic leaders as exaggerated tales from defeated enemies, described horsemen who seemed to live permanently mounted, subsisting on mare's milk and raw meat while moving with supernatural speed across vast distances. The Hunnic practice of artificial cranial deformation, which created distinctively elongated skulls among their elite warriors, contributed to their fearsome reputation and reinforced perceptions of their otherworldly nature. The Hunnic military organisation represented a synthesis of steppe warfare traditions perfected through centuries of conflict across the Eurasian landmass. Their armies consisted of decimal units organised into groups of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000 warriors, with each level commanded by experienced officers who maintained strict discipline through a combination of rewards and brutal punishments. The Hunnic communication system, utilising mounted messengers and signal fires, enabled coordination of forces across distances that would have been impossible for Gothic armies dependent on foot messengers and horn calls. The technological advantages possessed by Hunnic forces extended beyond their famous composite bows to encompass sophisticated siege equipment and metallurgical techniques acquired through contact with Chinese and Persian civilizations. Hunnic siege engines, including torsion catapults and battering rams, enabled them to assault fortified positions that had previously provided Gothic communities with security against nomadic raiders. Their weapons and armour, crafted from superior steel alloys and featuring innovative designs, gave individual Hunnic warriors significant advantages in close combat against traditionally equipped Gothic opponents. The strategic approach employed by Hunnic commanders demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and the importance of disrupting enemy morale before engaging in direct combat. Hunnic armies typically advanced in multiple columns that maintained communication while creating the impression of omnipresence across vast territories. Their practice of driving captured livestock and civilian populations before their advancing forces created refugee streams that overwhelmed defensive preparations and spread panic among settled populations. The Ostrogothic kingdom of Germanic, which had reached its zenith during the mid-4th century, encompassed territories stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and included dozens of tribal groups united under Greuthungi leadership. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a sophisticated political organisation capable of coordinating agricultural production, craft manufacture, and military operations across distances exceeding 1,000 kilometres. The kingdom's prosperity derived from control of major trade routes connecting northern Europe with Mediterranean markets, while its military strength rested on the integration of diverse tribal traditions into a unified fighting force. Germanic himself, described in later Gothic traditions as a ruler of exceptional longevity and wisdom, had spent decades consolidating Ostrogothic control over the Pontic steppes through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic alliance. His court, located in the region between the Dnieper and Don rivers, attracted warriors, craftsmen and merchants from across Eastern Europe and created a cosmopolitan centre that rivaled contemporary Roman cities in its wealth and cultural sophistication. The king's advanced age, reportedly over 100 years at the time of the Hunnic invasion, may have contributed to the kingdom's inability to respond effectively to the unprecedented threat. The initial Hunnic assault on Ostrogothic territories occurred with devastating swiftness during the winter of 376 AD, when frozen rivers provided highways for cavalry movement and Gothic defensive preparations were hampered by severe weather conditions. Hunnic forces, accustomed to winter warfare and equipped with specialized cold weather gear, maintained their mobility while Gothic armies struggled with logistical challenges and reduced effectiveness of their traditional fighting methods. The timing of the attack demonstrated Hunnic strategic sophistication and their understanding of seasonal advantages in steppe warfare. The Battle of the Dnieper, fought in early 376 AD, marked the decisive engagement that destroyed Ostrogothic resistance and led to the collapse of Ermanaric's kingdom. Gothic forces, numbering approximately 15,000 warriors drawn from various tribal groups, attempted to establish defensive positions along the river's western bank, while Hunnic cavalry maintained pressure through constant harassment and feigned retreats. The Gothic strategy of fighting dismounted behind improvised fortifications proved ineffective against Hunnic mobility and their ability to coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The Hunnic tactical approach at the Dnieper demonstrated their mastery of combined arms warfare and their ability to adapt traditional steppe tactics to specific battlefield conditions. Their mounted archers maintained constant pressure on Gothic formations while avoiding direct engagement, gradually wearing down Gothic morale and ammunition supplies. When Gothic warriors attempted to break out of their defensive positions, Hunnic heavy cavalry units, equipped with lances and scale armour, struck with devastating effect against disordered formations. The death of Ermanaric during the battle, whether from wounds sustained in combat or from suicide as later Gothic traditions claimed, symbolised the complete collapse of Ostrogothic resistance and the end of an era in Gothic history. The loss of their legendary king, combined with the destruction of their military forces and the occupation of their territories, created a psychological trauma that would influence Gothic collective memory for generations. The surviving members of the Ostrogothic nobility faced the choice between submission to Hunnic rule or flight to uncertain refuge in distant territories. The subjugation of Eastern Gothic tribes following the collapse of Ermanaric's kingdom involved a systematic process of political reorganisation that demonstrated Hunnic administrative capabilities and their understanding of governing settled populations. The Huns did not simply destroy Gothic society, but rather incorporated useful elements into their expanding confederation, while eliminating potential sources of resistance. Gothic warriors who submitted were integrated into Hunnic military units, while Gothic craftsmen and administrators were employed in maintaining the complex logistical systems required for nomadic empire. The Hunnic treatment of Gothic populations varied significantly depending on their perceived value and potential for resistance. Skilled metal workers, particularly those capable of producing weapons and armour, received privileged treatment and were relocated to areas where their expertise could be most effectively utilised. Agricultural communities that submitted peacefully were permitted to maintain their traditional practices while providing tribute in grain and livestock to support Hunnic military operations. The integration of Gothic military traditions into Hunnic warfare created hybrid tactical systems that combined steppe mobility with Germanic close combat techniques. Gothic heavy infantry, fighting in disciplined formations with spears and shields, provided Hunnic armies with capabilities for siege warfare and defensive operations that complemented their traditional cavalry strengths. The adoption of Gothic metalworking techniques enabled Hunnic smiths to produce improved weapons and armour that enhanced their military effectiveness. The psychological impact of Ostrogothic collapse reverberated throughout the Gothic world and created panic among Visigothic communities west of the Dniester River. The destruction of Ermanaric's kingdom, long considered the most powerful Gothic political entity, demonstrated that no traditional defensive strategy could withstand Hunnic military capabilities. The streams of refugees fleeing westward brought first-hand accounts of Hunnic warfare that intensified fears and contributed to the growing sense of crisis among Visigothic leaders. The Visigothic response to the Hunnic threat reflected both their different political organisation and their proximity to Roman territories that offered potential refuge. Unlike the centralised Ostrogothic kingdom, Visigothic society remained organised around multiple competing chieftains who struggled to coordinate unified resistance efforts. The democratic traditions of Gothic assemblies, which had provided effective governance during peacetime, proved inadequate for making the rapid decisions required by military crisis. The Visigothic king Fritigern emerged as the dominant leader during this period of crisis through his combination of military experience and diplomatic skill. His previous conflicts with rival Gothic chieftains had provided him with knowledge of both Gothic military capabilities and their limitations when confronted by superior enemies. Fritigern's assessment of Hunnic strength led him to conclude that successful resistance required either Roman military assistance or evacuation to Roman territory, where Gothic populations could regroup and rebuild their strength. The internal debates within Visigothic society regarding response to the Hunnic threat revealed fundamental divisions about Gothic identity and their relationship with Roman civilization. Conservative elements, led by chieftains like Alaric, advocated for continued resistance from traditional Gothic territories and rejected any accommodation with Rome that might compromise Gothic independence. Progressive factions, influenced by increasing Christian conversion and commercial relationships with Roman merchants, viewed cooperation with the empire as the only viable survival strategy. The religious dimensions of the Visigothic crisis included growing Christian influence and the belief among some Gothic leaders that their traditional pagan gods had proven inadequate against the Hunnic threat. The Christian emphasis on divine providence and the possibility of salvation through faith provided alternative explanations for Gothic suffering that competed with traditional Germanic concepts of fate and heroic resistance. The conversion of significant portions of the Visigothic population to Arian Christianity during this period reflected both genuine religious conviction and practical calculations about divine protection. The decision to seek Roman refuge represented a fundamental transformation in Gothic political strategy and marked the beginning of a new phase in Gothic-Roman relations. The traditional Gothic preference for independence and their pride in military prowess made the prospect of seeking imperial protection deeply humiliating for many warriors and nobles. The practical necessities of survival, however, overcame cultural preferences as reports of continued Hunnic advances made clear that remaining in their ancestral territories would result in death or enslavement. The diplomatic negotiations between Visigothic representatives and Roman officials during 376 AD reveal the complexity of the situation facing both parties. Emperor Valens, preoccupied with Persian threats in the east and internal religious controversies, initially viewed the Gothic request for asylum as an opportunity to acquire military recruits and agricultural workers for the empire's chronically underpopulated Balkan provinces. The Roman assessment of Gothic military capabilities, based on their performance in previous conflicts, led imperial officials to underestimate the challenges involved in accommodating large numbers of armed barbarians within Roman territory. The terms proposed by Roman negotiators reflected both imperial arrogance and practical considerations about managing barbarian populations. The Goths would be permitted to cross the Danube and settle in designated areas of Thrace, but they would be required to surrender their weapons, provide hostages from noble families, and accept Roman administrative oversight of their communities. These conditions, while providing security from a Hunnic attack, effectively reduced the Goths from independent allies to dependent subjects within the Roman system. The Gothic response to Roman terms revealed the desperation of their situation and the internal divisions that continued to plague their decision-making processes. Fritigern's faction, convinced that survival required acceptance of Roman conditions regardless of their humiliating nature, advocated for immediate agreement and rapid evacuation across the Danube. Opposition groups, led by Athanaric and other traditional chieftains, rejected Roman terms as incompatible with Gothic honour and proposed continued resistance from mountain strongholds in the Carpathians. The crossing of the Danube in late 376 AD involved logistical challenges that strained both Gothic organisational capabilities and Roman administrative resources. The Gothic population seeking refuge included not only warriors and their families, but also craftsmen, slaves, livestock, and portable wealth that represented the accumulated prosperity of centuries. The Roman officials responsible for managing the crossing, primarily concerned with preventing the entry of weapons and ensuring accurate population counts, proved inadequate for handling an operation of such magnitude. The Roman military units assigned to supervise the Gothic crossing consisted primarily of frontier troops with limited experience in managing large-scale population movements. The corruption and incompetence of Roman officials, particularly the commanders Lupicinus and Maximus, created additional complications as they attempted to profit personally from Gothic desperation. The Roman practice of demanding bribes for basic services and their seizure of Gothic property created immediate tensions that would escalate into open conflict. The Gothic experience during the crossing process revealed the extent of Roman administrative breakdown and the empire's inability to manage the crisis effectively. Families were separated during the chaotic river crossings, while inadequate Roman provisions created immediate shortages of food and shelter for Gothic refugees. The Roman failure to provide promised supplies, combined with their continued demands for weapon surrenders and hostage delivery, convinced many Goths that imperial officials were acting in bad faith. The immediate aftermath of the Danube crossing witnessed the breakdown of Roman Gothic cooperation and the emergence of conditions that would lead to widespread rebellion. The concentration of Gothic populations in inadequate camps, combined with Roman restrictions on movement and commerce, created a humanitarian crisis that Roman authorities proved incapable of addressing. The Gothic warriors, despite having surrendered many of their weapons, retained sufficient military capability to resist Roman attempts at complete subjugation. The incident at Marcianople, where Roman officials attempted to assassinate Gothic leaders during a supposed diplomatic banquet, provided the immediate catalyst for Gothic rebellion and demonstrated the extent of Roman duplicity. The failure of this assassination attempt, combined with the Gothic rescue of their threatened leaders, convinced remaining Gothic moderates that cooperation with Rome was impossible. The outbreak of violence that followed marked the beginning of a conflict that would devastate the Balkans and ultimately result in the death of a Roman emperor. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the makeshift Gothic camps scattered across Thrace during the winter of 377 AD created conditions that would transform desperate refugees into a formidable military force capable of challenging Roman imperial authority. The Roman officials responsible for managing the Gothic settlement, particularly the commanders Lupicinus and Maximus, had systematically exploited their positions to extract personal profit from Gothic desperation, while failing to provide the basic necessities promised during the initial negotiations. Their corrupt practices included selling dog meat to starving Gothic families at inflated prices, demanding sexual favours from Gothic women in exchange for food rations, and confiscating valuable possessions under the pretense of weapon searches. The Gothic warriors, despite having surrendered many of their weapons during the river crossing, had retained sufficient military equipment through concealment and bribery to pose a significant threat to Roman authority. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals that Gothic smiths continued operating within the refugee camps, repairing damaged weapons and crafting new ones from scavenged materials. The Roman failure to establish effective control over Gothic metalworking capabilities would prove crucial in the coming conflict, as Gothic forces gradually rebuilt their military strength while Roman officials remained focused on extracting immediate profits. The breakdown of Roman supply systems during the harsh winter months created acute shortages of food, fuel and shelter that pushed Gothic communities toward the brink of starvation. Roman logistical planning, adequate for maintaining frontier garrisons numbering in the hundreds, proved completely inadequate for supporting refugee populations exceeding 100,000 individuals. The empire's chronic financial difficulties, exacerbated by ongoing conflicts with Persia and internal political instability, meant that resources allocated for Gothic support were frequently diverted to other military priorities. The social dynamics within Gothic refugee communities underwent significant transformation as traditional hierarchies adapted to the desperate circumstances of displacement. The warrior aristocracy, stripped of their territorial bases and reduced to dependence on Roman charity, struggled to maintain authority over followers who faced immediate threats to their survival. The democratic traditions of Gothic assemblies became forums for increasingly radical discussions about resistance to Roman authority, with younger warriors advocating for immediate action against their oppressors. The emergence of Fritigern as the dominant Gothic leader during this crisis reflected both his previous military experience and his ability to articulate Gothic grievances in terms that resonated with diverse tribal groups. His leadership style combined traditional Germanic concepts of warrior kingship with pragmatic assessment of Roman military capabilities and political weaknesses. Fritigern's strategic thinking recognized that Gothic survival required not merely escape from Roman oppression, but the establishment of secure territorial bases where Gothic communities could rebuild their strength. The religious dimensions of Gothic resistance included the growing influence of Arian Christianity and its emphasis on divine justice for the oppressed. Gothic Christian leaders, trained in biblical interpretation and familiar with stories of divine deliverance, provided theological justification for resistance against Roman persecution. The Christian concept of righteous warfare against ungodly oppressors offered Gothic warriors moral legitimacy for their rebellion while maintaining their religious identity within the broader Christian world. The incident at Marcianople in early 377 AD, where Roman officials attempted to assassinate Gothic leaders during a diplomatic banquet, provided the immediate catalyst that transformed Gothic discontent into open rebellion. The Roman plan, apparently coordinated by Lupicinus and designed to eliminate Gothic leadership through treachery, demonstrated the extent of imperial desperation and the complete breakdown of diplomatic relations. The failure of this assassination attempt, combined with the Gothic rescue of their threatened leaders, convinced remaining Gothic moderates that cooperation with Rome was impossible. The outbreak of violence following the Marcianople incident revealed the extent of Gothic military preparation and their ability to coordinate resistance activities across multiple refugee camps. Gothic warriors, despite Roman restrictions on their movement, had maintained communication networks that enabled rapid mobilization of forces throughout Thrace. The simultaneous uprising of Gothic communities across the province demonstrated sophisticated planning and organization that surprised Roman officials who had underestimated Gothic capabilities. The initial Gothic military operations focused on securing weapons and supplies necessary for sustained resistance against Roman authority. Gothic forces systematically attacked Roman armories, supply depots, and administrative centres while avoiding direct confrontation with major Roman military units. Their intimate knowledge of local geography, acquired through months of forced residence in the region, provided significant advantages in conducting guerrilla operations against Roman forces unfamiliar with the terrain. The Roman military response to Gothic rebellion revealed the empire's chronic manpower shortages and the poor quality of frontier troops available for immediate deployment. The Danubian legions, weakened by years of budget cuts and recruitment difficulties, lacked the training and equipment necessary for effective counterinsurgency operations. The Roman reliance on static defensive positions, designed for preventing barbarian incursions rather than suppressing internal rebellions, proved inadequate for confronting Gothic forces operating within imperial territory. The Gothic adoption of Roman military equipment and techniques accelerated rapidly as their forces captured imperial armories and recruited Roman deserters to their cause. Gothic warriors began wearing Roman armour and carrying Roman weapons while maintaining their traditional tactical preferences and command structures. The integration of Roman military technology with Gothic fighting methods created hybrid forces that combined barbarian mobility and aggression with imperial discipline and organisation. The expansion of Gothic territorial control during 377 AD demonstrated their ability to establish effective administration over conquered Roman territories. Gothic forces occupied major cities including Adrianople, Philippopolis and Nicopolis, while establishing fortified camps that served as bases for further military operations. The Gothic treatment of conquered Roman populations varied significantly, communities that submitted peacefully receiving protection, while those that resisted faced destruction and enslavement. The Roman diplomatic efforts to resolve the Gothic crisis through negotiation revealed the empire's recognition of its military limitations and the growing strength of Gothic resistance. Emperor Valens, preoccupied with Persian threats in the east, initially sought to end the Gothic rebellion through political settlement rather than military conquest. The Roman offers of expanded settlement rights and increased subsidies demonstrated imperial willingness to make significant concessions to restore stability in the Balkans. The Gothic rejection of Roman diplomatic overtures reflected their growing confidence in their military capabilities and their determination to achieve genuine independence rather than merely improved conditions of subjugation. Fritigern's demands included recognition of Gothic territorial autonomy, the removal of corrupt Roman officials, and guarantees of religious freedom for Arian Christians. The incompatibility of these demands with Roman concepts of imperial sovereignty made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. The military preparations undertaken by both sides during the winter of 377-378 AD revealed the scale and significance of the coming conflict. Emperor Valens assembled a substantial army including elements from the Eastern Field Armies, Danubian frontier forces, and allied barbarian units recruited from various tribes. This force, numbering approximately 20,000 men, represented one of the largest Roman armies deployed in the Balkans during the 4th century, and demonstrated imperial determination to crush Gothic resistance definitively. The Gothic military organisation during this period reflected their adaptation to the requirements of sustained warfare against Roman forces. Fritigern established a unified command structure that integrated various tribal groups while maintaining their traditional fighting methods and unit identities. The Gothic army included not only warriors from the original refugee population, but also recruits from other barbarian groups who joined the rebellion and Roman deserters who provided technical expertise. The logistical challenges facing both armies during the campaign season of 378 AD highlighted the importance of supply lines and local support in determining military outcomes. The Gothic forces, operating in familiar territory with significant civilian support, maintained advantages in intelligence gathering and resource acquisition. The Roman army, dependent on extended supply lines and operating in hostile territory, faced constant harassment and supply shortages that reduced their operational effectiveness. The strategic situation on the eve of the Battle of Adrianople reflected the complex political and military dynamics that had developed during 2 years of Gothic rebellion. The Roman Empire, despite its vast resources and military traditions, found itself confronting a barbarian force that had successfully adapted to Roman military methods while maintaining the tactical flexibility that had made Germanic warriors formidable opponents. The Gothic Confederation, despite its origins as a desperate refugee population, had evolved into a sophisticated military organisation capable of challenging imperial authority in the empire's heartland. The approach of the Roman army toward Adrianople in August 378 AD occurred under conditions of extreme heat and logistical strain that affected both the physical condition of Roman troops and their tactical capabilities. The imperial forces, heavily armoured and carrying substantial equipment loads, suffered from dehydration and exhaustion as they marched across the sun-baked Thracian plains. The Roman supply train, already stretched thin by the demands of maintaining a large army in hostile territory, struggled to provide adequate water and provisions for the advancing forces. The Gothic defensive position near Adrianople demonstrated Fritigern's sophisticated understanding of battlefield tactics and his ability to exploit Roman weaknesses. The Gothic camp, protected by a circular arrangement of wagons and earthworks, occupied elevated ground that provided defensive advantages while limiting Roman options for flanking manoeuvres. The wagon lager, a defensive formation borrowed from steppe nomadic traditions, created a fortified base that could withstand Roman attacks while serving as a rallying point for Gothic forces. The composition of the Gothic army at Adrianople reflected the diverse nature of the forces that had joined Fritigern's rebellion. The core of Gothic strength consisted of traditional Germanic infantry armed with spears, shields, and single-edged swords, organised into tribal units that maintained their traditional fighting methods and leadership structures. These warriors, hardened by 2 years of constant warfare, possessed combat experience and unit cohesion that rivaled the best Roman formations. The Gothic cavalry component included both traditional Germanic horsemen and Sarmatian heavy cavalry units that had joined the rebellion during its expansion phase. The Sarmatian cataphracts, equipped with scale armour and long lances, provided the Goths with shock capabilities that could break Roman infantry formations. The integration of diverse cavalry traditions within the Gothic army created a flexible mounted force capable of both reconnaissance and decisive combat operations. The Roman tactical approach at Adrianople reflected traditional imperial doctrine, emphasizing disciplined infantry formations supported by cavalry and artillery. The Roman battle line consisted of heavy infantry legions deployed in the centre, with auxiliary units and allied barbarian forces on the flanks. The Roman cavalry, positioned on the wings, was intended to protect the infantry flanks while seeking opportunities to exploit Gothic weaknesses. The initial phase of the battle began with Roman attempts to negotiate a settlement while maintaining military pressure on Gothic positions. Emperor Valens, recognising the strength of the Gothic defensive position, sought to avoid costly frontal assaults by offering terms that might divide Gothic leadership and reduce their fighting effectiveness. The Roman negotiating strategy reflected both genuine desire to minimise casualties and tactical calculations about the advantages of fighting a weakened enemy. The Gothic response to Roman diplomatic overtures demonstrated their confidence in their military position and their determination to achieve decisive victory rather than temporary accommodation. Fritigern's rejection of Roman terms, combined with his demand for complete Gothic independence, made clear that the conflict could only be resolved through military action. The breakdown of negotiations eliminated the possibility of peaceful resolution and committed both sides to a decisive battle. The Roman assault on the Gothic wagon lager began with coordinated attacks by infantry and cavalry units, designed to overwhelm Gothic defences through superior numbers and equipment. The Roman legions, advancing in traditional formation with shields locked and spears levelled, initially made progress against Gothic defensive positions. The disciplined advance of Roman heavy infantry, supported by artillery bombardment, created breaches in the Gothic perimeter that threatened to collapse their entire defensive system. The decisive moment of the battle came when Gothic cavalry forces, returning from foraging operations, struck the exposed Roman right flank while it was engaged in assaulting the wagon fortifications. The Gothic horsemen, led by Sarmatian cataphracts and supported by traditional Germanic cavalry, charged into the Roman formations with devastating effect. The impact of armoured cavalry against infantry caught in the act of assault created immediate chaos in Roman ranks and disrupted their tactical coordination. The collapse of Roman formation integrity following the Gothic cavalry charge led to widespread panic as individual units found themselves surrounded and cut off from mutual support. The Roman army, which had maintained discipline during the initial assault, disintegrated as soldiers abandoned their positions and fled in disorder. The Gothic infantry, emerging from their defensive positions, joined the cavalry in pursuing the retreating Romans and completing the destruction of imperial forces. Emperor Valens died during the chaotic retreat that followed the Gothic breakthrough, struck down while attempting to rally his collapsing forces. The death of the emperor in battle represented an unprecedented disaster for Roman prestige and demonstrated the complete collapse of imperial authority in the face of barbarian military superiority. The loss of imperial leadership eliminated any possibility of organising effective resistance and ensured the total destruction of Roman forces. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople witnessed the complete disintegration of Roman military power in the Balkans and the establishment of Gothic control over vast territories previously under imperial administration. The Gothic victory provided them with enormous quantities of military equipment, including weapons, armour and siege engines that would enhance their capabilities for future operations. The capture of Roman standards and imperial regalia demonstrated the extent of their triumph and provided powerful symbols of their victory over the empire. The political consequences of Valens's death created a succession crisis that paralysed Roman response to the Gothic victory and prevented effective imperial counteraction. The absence of clear succession arrangements, combined with the destruction of much of the Eastern Field Army, left the empire vulnerable to further Gothic expansion and unable to mount immediate military operations to restore imperial control. The Gothic success at Adrianople fundamentally altered the balance of power between the empire and its barbarian neighbours, establishing precedents that would influence European politics for centuries to come. The catastrophic defeat at Adrianople fundamentally transformed the relationship between the Gothic peoples and the Roman Empire, creating conditions that would eventually lead to the establishment of the first successful barbarian kingdom within former imperial territory. The immediate aftermath of Emperor Valens's death left the Eastern Empire in political chaos, with no clear succession mechanism and the majority of its field army destroyed on the Thracian plains. The new emperor, Theodosius I, who assumed power in 379 AD, faced the daunting task of rebuilding imperial military strength while simultaneously containing Gothic expansion throughout the Balkans. The Gothic Confederation under Fritigern's leadership had evolved far beyond its origins as a desperate refugee population. The victory at Adrianople provided them with vast quantities of Roman military equipment, including siege engines, artillery pieces, and complete sets of legionary armour that enhanced their already formidable capabilities. More significantly, the battle had demonstrated to both Goths and Romans that barbarian forces could not only defeat imperial armies but completely destroy them, fundamentally altering the psychological dynamics of Gothic-Roman relations. The territorial situation following Adrianople saw Gothic forces controlling much of Thrace and portions of Moesia, with their influence extending across approximately 50,000 square kilometres of formerly Roman territory. Gothic warbands operated with virtual impunity throughout the region, besieging major cities and establishing fortified camps that served as bases for further expansion. The Roman defensive system, built around static fortifications and small garrison forces, proved completely inadequate for containing mobile Gothic armies that could concentrate overwhelming force at any point along the frontier. The evolution of Gothic military organisation during this period reflected their adaptation to the requirements of governing conquered territories while maintaining offensive capabilities. Fritigern established a hierarchical command structure that integrated various tribal groups under unified leadership, while preserving their traditional fighting methods and cultural identities. The Gothic army included not only the original Tervingi refugees, but also Grithungi survivors who had escaped Hunnic domination, various other Germanic tribes, and significant numbers of Roman deserters who provided technical expertise in siege warfare and military engineering. The death of Fritigern in 380 AD created a succession crisis within the Gothic Confederation that threatened to fragment their military and political unity. The traditional Germanic method of selecting leaders through assembly consensus proved inadequate for managing the complex political situation created by their territorial conquests and ongoing conflict with Rome. The emergence of multiple competing chieftains, each commanding different tribal segments and pursuing distinct strategic objectives, weakened Gothic military effectiveness and created opportunities for Roman diplomatic intervention. Theodosius II's response to the Gothic crisis demonstrated both pragmatic assessment of imperial limitations and innovative approaches to barbarian management. Rather than attempting to crush Gothic resistance through direct military confrontation, which had proven disastrously unsuccessful under Valens, the new emperor pursued a policy of negotiated settlement that would transform Gothic raiders into Roman allies. This strategic shift reflected both the empire's reduced military capabilities and growing recognition that barbarian peoples could serve imperial interests when properly managed. The negotiations between Theodosius and Gothic leaders during 381-382 AD resulted in the first formal Foedus agreement that would establish the legal framework for barbarian settlement within Roman territory. The treaty recognized Gothic territorial autonomy within designated areas of Thrace, while requiring them to provide military service to the empire under their own commanders. This arrangement represented a fundamental departure from traditional Roman policy, which had insisted on complete barbarian submission to imperial authority. The terms of the Foedus agreement reflected the realities of power following Adrianople while maintaining face-saving formalities for Roman dignity. The Goths would retain their weapons, maintain their traditional leadership structures, and govern their territories according to their own laws and customs. In exchange, they would provide military service when requested by imperial authorities and refrain from attacking Roman territories or populations. The empire would provide annual subsidies in gold and supplies, while guaranteeing Gothic territorial integrity against external threats. The implementation of the Foedus system required significant adjustments from both Gothic and Roman populations, as they adapted to new forms of coexistence within imperial territory. Gothic communities established permanent settlements in assigned territories, constructing fortified towns and agricultural villages that combined traditional Germanic building techniques with Roman architectural elements. Archaeological evidence from sites like Nicopolis at Istrum reveals Gothic settlements featuring timber-framed houses with stone foundations, craft workshops, and Christian churches that demonstrate the cultural synthesis emerging from this period. The Gothic military obligations under the Foedus agreement involved providing troops for imperial campaigns while maintaining their traditional fighting methods and command structures. Gothic warriors served alongside Roman legions in campaigns against Persian forces, Danubian tribes, and other barbarian groups, demonstrating their value as military allies while gaining experience in Roman tactical methods. The integration of Gothic and Roman forces created hybrid military units that combined barbarian mobility and aggression with imperial discipline and organization. The religious dimensions of Gothic settlement within Roman territory involved complex negotiations between Arian and Nicene Christian communities. The Goths' adherence to Arian Christianity, which denied the full divinity of Christ and rejected the Nicene Creed, created theological tensions with Roman populations and imperial authorities. However, the practical necessities of maintaining political stability led to official tolerance of Gothic religious practices while encouraging gradual conversion to Orthodox Christianity through missionary activities and intermarriage. The economic integration of Gothic communities within the Roman system created new patterns of trade and resource utilisation that benefited both populations. Gothic agricultural production, particularly grain cultivation and livestock raising, helped address chronic food shortages in the Balkans, while providing Gothic communities with surplus products for trade. Gothic craftsmen, skilled in metalworking and textile production, found ready markets for their goods in Roman cities while adopting Roman techniques and decorative styles. The political evolution of Gothic society under the feudus system reflected their adaptation to the requirements of governing settled territories while maintaining their traditional cultural identity. Gothic kings and chieftains established courts that combined Germanic assembly traditions with Roman administrative practices, creating governmental institutions capable of managing complex territorial and diplomatic responsibilities. The emergence of Gothic legal codes that integrated traditional Germanic law with Roman legal principles demonstrated the sophisticated nature of this cultural synthesis. The success of the initial feudus arrangement encouraged similar agreements with other barbarian groups and established precedents for barbarian settlement that would influence imperial policy throughout the 5th century. The Gothic example demonstrated that barbarian peoples could be transformed from destructive raiders into valuable allies through appropriate political arrangements and territorial concessions. This model would be applied to Vandals, Burgundians and other Germanic tribes as the empire struggled to maintain control over its vast territories. The reign of Alaric I, who emerged as the dominant Gothic leader during the 390 SAD, marked a new phase in Gothic-Roman relations, characterized by increasing Gothic assertiveness and territorial ambitions. Alaric's background as a Roman military officer who had served in imperial campaigns provided him with intimate knowledge of Roman military capabilities and political weaknesses. His leadership style combined traditional Germanic warrior culture with sophisticated understanding of Roman diplomatic and administrative systems. The Gothic military campaigns under Alaric's leadership demonstrated their evolution from desperate refugees to a formidable military force capable of challenging Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean world. The Gothic army had grown substantially through recruitment of additional barbarian groups and Roman deserters, while their military capabilities had been enhanced through acquisition of Roman siege equipment and training in imperial tactical methods. The Goths now possessed the organisational capacity to conduct sustained campaigns across vast distances while maintaining supply lines and coordinating multiple army groups. The invasion of Italy in 401 AD represented Alaric's most ambitious undertaking and demonstrated Gothic capabilities for strategic planning and execution on an unprecedented scale. The Gothic forces, numbering approximately 30,000 warriors plus their families and support personnel, crossed the Alps during winter conditions that had previously been considered impassable for large armies. The logistical achievements required for this operation, including the transportation of siege equipment and supplies across mountain passes, indicated sophisticated organisational capabilities that rivaled those of Roman armies. The Siege of Milan in 402 AD revealed the extent of Gothic military development and their mastery of Roman siege techniques. Gothic forces surrounded the city with elaborate earthworks and siege lines that demonstrated their ability to conduct complex engineering operations. The Gothic employment of battering rams, siege towers and catapults showed their adaptation of Roman military technology while maintaining their traditional emphasis on mobility and aggressive tactics. The siege's duration of several months indicated Gothic logistical capabilities and their confidence in their ability to maintain large forces in enemy territory. The Battle of Pollentia in 402 AD, fought between Gothic forces and the Roman army under Stilicho, demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Gothic military organisation had achieved. The Gothic battle formation combined traditional Germanic infantry tactics with cavalry units that included both Germanic horsemen and Sarmatian cataphracts. The Gothic use of feigned retreats and coordinated attacks by multiple unit types showed their mastery of complex battlefield maneuvers that required extensive training and discipline. The aftermath of the Italian campaigns established Alaric as the most prominent barbarian leader of his generation and demonstrated Gothic capabilities for sustained military operations within the Roman heartland. The Gothic withdrawal from Italy occurred not due to military defeat, but because of political negotiations that provided them with substantial territorial concessions and financial subsidies. This outcome reinforced Gothic confidence in their military superiority, while establishing precedents for future negotiations with imperial authorities. The sack of Rome in 410 AD represented the culmination of Gothic military and political development under Alaric's leadership. The capture of the Eternal City, which had not fallen to foreign enemies for over 800 years, demonstrated the complete transformation of Gothic society from refugee population to conquering power. The 3-day occupation of Rome provided the Goths with enormous quantities of gold, silver and precious objects that would finance their subsequent military operations and territorial expansion. The Gothic treatment of Rome during the sack revealed their sophisticated understanding of political symbolism and their desire to present themselves as legitimate successors to Roman authority, rather than mere barbarian destroyers. Alaric's forces respected Christian churches and clergy, while systematically looting pagan temples and imperial palaces. This selective approach to destruction demonstrated Gothic political calculations about maintaining support from Christian populations while eliminating symbols of imperial resistance. The immediate consequences of Rome's fall included the collapse of imperial prestige throughout the Western Mediterranean and the acceleration of barbarian settlement within Roman territories. The Gothic demonstration that Roman military power could be overcome encouraged other barbarian groups to pursue more aggressive policies toward the empire. The psychological impact of Rome's capture reverberated throughout the ancient world and marked the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. The Gothic migration to southern Gaul following Alaric's death in 410 AD reflected their strategic assessment of territorial opportunities and their desire to establish permanent settlement in fertile agricultural regions. The Gothic forces, now led by Alaric's successor Ataulf, recognised that their military successes required consolidation through territorial control and agricultural production. The movement into Gaul provided access to the rich agricultural lands of Aquitaine while positioning Gothic forces to exploit the ongoing conflicts between various Roman claimants to imperial authority. The establishment of Gothic settlements in Toulouse and surrounding territories during 418 AD marked the beginning of the Visigothic kingdom as a permanent political entity. The Gothic occupation of this region occurred through a combination of military conquest and negotiated settlement with Roman authorities who recognised their inability to maintain effective control over the area. The Gothic territorial base in Aquitaine provided them with agricultural resources, strategic positioning and defensive advantages that would enable their kingdom to survive for nearly 3 centuries. The expansion of Visigothic territory into Hispania during the 450 SAD represented the natural extension of their territorial ambitions and their response to opportunities created by the collapse of Roman authority in the peninsula. The Gothic invasion of Spain occurred at the invitation of Roman authorities who sought barbarian assistance in suppressing the rebellion of the Bargaudi and containing the expansion of Suevic and Vandal kingdoms. The Gothic military intervention in Spanish affairs gradually evolved into permanent occupation as they established control over major cities and agricultural regions. The conflict with the Suevi in northwestern Spain demonstrated Visigothic military capabilities and their determination to establish hegemony over the entire peninsula. The Suevic kingdom, established in Galicia during the early 5th century, possessed substantial military strength and territorial resources that made them formidable opponents. The Gothic campaigns against the Suevi required sustained military operations over difficult terrain and demonstrated their ability to conduct complex strategic operations while maintaining control over their existing territories. The Visigothic conquest of the Vandal territories in southern Spain eliminated their most dangerous rivals and established Gothic control over the peninsula's richest agricultural regions. The Vandals, who had established a powerful kingdom in Baetica during the 420 SAD, possessed naval capabilities and African connections that made them particularly threatening to Gothic interests. The Gothic military success against the Vandals demonstrated their tactical superiority and their ability to coordinate land and naval operations. The establishment of Toledo as the Visigothic capital during the late 5th century reflected their recognition of the city's strategic importance and its symbolic significance as the centre of Roman administration in Spain. The Gothic occupation of Toledo provided them with access to the peninsula's administrative records, legal traditions, and governmental institutions that would prove crucial for establishing effective rule over their diverse territories. The city's central location enabled Gothic rulers to maintain control over both their Gallic and Spanish territories, while coordinating military operations across vast distances. The development of Visigothic legal codes during the 6th and 7th centuries represented one of their most significant contributions to European civilization and demonstrated their sophisticated approach to governing diverse populations. The Breviary of Alaric, promulgated in 506 AD, provided a simplified version of Roman law adapted for use by both Gothic and Roman populations within the kingdom. This legal compilation demonstrated Gothic recognition of the importance of legal continuity and their desire to maintain Roman governmental traditions while adapting them to Germanic cultural practices. The Liber Judiciorum, completed during the reign of Receswinthe in 654 AD, represented the culmination of Visigothic legal development and created a unified legal system that applied to all inhabitants of the kingdom regardless of their ethnic background. This comprehensive legal code addressed criminal law, civil disputes, commercial regulations, and family relationships, while incorporating both Germanic and Roman legal traditions. The code's emphasis on written law and judicial procedures demonstrated the sophisticated nature of Visigothic governmental institutions. The administrative system developed by Visigothic rulers combined Germanic political traditions with Roman bureaucratic practices to create governmental institutions capable of managing territories that extended from the Loire River to Gibraltar. The Gothic kings established a hierarchy of appointed officials who administered justice, collected taxes, and maintained military forces throughout the kingdom. The integration of Roman administrative personnel with Gothic nobles created a governmental system that maintained continuity with imperial traditions while adapting to Germanic political culture. The gradual integration of Gothic and Hispano-Roman populations occurred through intermarriage, religious conversion, and shared participation in governmental and military institutions. The initial prohibition on intermarriage between Goths and Romans, established to maintain ethnic distinctions, gradually broke down as practical considerations and political alliances encouraged integration. The conversion of the Visigothic royal family to Catholic Christianity during the late 6th century eliminated the primary religious barrier to integration and facilitated the emergence of a unified Spanish Christian culture. The conversion of the Visigothic royal family to Catholic Christianity during the late 6th century marked not only a religious transformation, but also the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between Gothic peoples and the broader European world. While the Visigoths consolidated their power in Spain, their Ostrogothic cousins had been following a dramatically different path that would lead to one of the most remarkable cultural achievements of the early medieval period. The Ostrogoths, who had remained under Hunnic domination for nearly a century following the collapse of Ermaneric's kingdom, had gradually rebuilt their strength and identity within the complex political landscape of the late 5th century. The emergence of Theodoric as the dominant figure among the Ostrogoths occurred against the backdrop of Byzantine political manoeuvring and the ongoing struggle for control over the Italian peninsula. Born around 454 AD, Theodoric had spent his youth as a hostage in Constantinople, where he received a Roman education and gained intimate knowledge of imperial administrative practices and diplomatic protocols. This unique background, combining Gothic warrior traditions with Byzantine sophistication, would prove crucial in his later achievements as both military commander and political leader. The decade of the 480s witnessed Theodoric's consolidation of power among the various Ostrogothic groups scattered across the Balkans, as he systematically eliminated rivals and unified the disparate tribal fragments into a coherent military force. His campaigns against competing Gothic chieftains demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his understanding of the political dynamics that had fragmented Ostrogothic society since the Hunnic invasions. The process of reunification required not only military victories, but also careful diplomacy and the reconstruction of traditional Gothic governmental institutions adapted to the realities of the late imperial period. The relationship between Theodoric and Emperor Zeno of Byzantium evolved from mutual suspicion to strategic partnership, as both leaders recognized the advantages of cooperation. Zeno, faced with the challenge of maintaining control over Italy while dealing with threats from Persia and internal rebellions, saw in Theodoric a potential solution to the problem of Odoacer's independent kingdom. The Gothic king, commanding a formidable army but lacking secure territorial base, recognized that imperial sponsorship could provide the legitimacy and resources necessary for major territorial conquest. The negotiations that led to Theodoric's Italian expedition in 489 AD reflected the complex political calculations of both Byzantine and Gothic leaders. The formal agreement granted Theodoric the authority to invade Italy and depose Odoacer in the emperor's name, with the understanding that successful conquest would result in Theodoric's recognition as imperial representative in the peninsula. This arrangement provided Zeno with a means of reasserting Byzantine authority over Italy, without committing his own military resources, while offering Theodoric the opportunity to establish a legitimate kingdom under imperial auspices. The Ostrogothic invasion of Italy began with a massive migration that included not only Theodoric's warriors, but also their families, livestock, and portable possessions, indicating the Gothic intention to establish permanent settlement rather than conduct temporary raids. The Gothic force, numbering approximately 100,000 individuals including roughly 20,000 warriors, represented one of the largest barbarian migrations of the late imperial period. The logistical challenges of moving such a large population across the Alps required sophisticated planning and organisation that demonstrated the administrative capabilities Theodoric had developed during his years of leadership. The military campaigns against Odoacer's forces revealed the tactical innovations that had evolved within Ostrogothic military organisation during their decades of service as Byzantine foederati. The Gothic army combined traditional Germanic infantry tactics with cavalry techniques learned from Hunnic and Sarmatian peoples, while incorporating Roman siege equipment and engineering methods acquired through their service in imperial campaigns. The integration of diverse military traditions created a flexible fighting force capable of adapting to various battlefield conditions and tactical challenges. The Siege of Ravenna, which lasted from 491 to 493 AD, demonstrated both the persistence of Gothic military pressure and the sophisticated nature of their strategic planning. The Gothic forces constructed elaborate siege works that surrounded the city with fortified camps connected by communication trenches and supply lines. The Gothic ability to maintain effective siege operations for over 2 years indicated their mastery of complex logistical systems and their confidence in their ability to outlast defenders who possessed superior fortifications but limited resources. The resolution of the siege through negotiated surrender rather than military assault reflected Theodoric's preference for political solutions that would minimise destruction and facilitate the integration of Italian populations into his emerging kingdom. The terms of Odoacer's surrender, which initially provided for joint rule between the two leaders, demonstrated Gothic willingness to compromise and their recognition of the importance of maintaining governmental continuity. The subsequent assassination of Odoacer during a banquet in 493 AD, while eliminating a potential rival, also established Theodoric's reputation for ruthlessness when political necessities demanded decisive action. The establishment of Ravenna as the capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom reflected both practical considerations about defensive positioning and symbolic recognition of the city's importance as the former seat of Western Roman imperial authority. The Gothic occupation of Ravenna provided them with access to the administrative records, legal precedents, and governmental institutions that had governed Italy during the final decades of imperial rule. The city's strategic location, protected by marshes and connected to the Adriatic Sea, offered defensive advantages while maintaining commercial and diplomatic connections with the broader Mediterranean world. The administrative system established by Theodoric represented a sophisticated synthesis of Gothic political traditions, with Roman bureaucratic practices that enabled effective governance of Italy's diverse populations. The Gothic king maintained the existing Roman administrative structure, while appointing Gothic nobles to key military and governmental positions, creating a dual system that preserved institutional continuity while ensuring Gothic political control. The retention of Roman legal codes and judicial procedures demonstrated Theodoric's recognition of the importance of legal continuity for maintaining social stability and economic prosperity. The religious policy pursued by Theodoric during the early years of his reign reflected his commitment to maintaining peace between the kingdom's diverse religious communities while preserving Gothic Aryan identity. The Gothic king's official tolerance of Catholic Christianity, combined with his protection of Arian churches and clergy, created a relatively stable religious environment that contrasted sharply with the religious conflicts that plagued other barbarian kingdoms. This policy of religious accommodation reflected both practical political calculations and Theodoric's personal commitment to maintaining the cultural synthesis that characterized his kingdom. The economic prosperity that characterized Italy during the early decades of Ostrogothic rule resulted from the combination of political stability, administrative efficiency, and the revival of trade relationships that had been disrupted during the political chaos of the late 5th century. The Gothic restoration of Roman tax collection systems, combined with their protection of agricultural production and commercial activities, created conditions that encouraged economic growth and population recovery. The archaeological evidence from Italian cities during this period reveals increased construction activity, expanded craft production, and growing commercial exchange that indicates genuine economic revival. The cultural achievements of Theodoric's court attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from throughout the Mediterranean world, creating an environment of learning and creativity that rivaled the greatest centres of late antique civilization. The Gothic king's patronage of education and literature reflected both his personal commitment to learning and his recognition of culture's importance for legitimizing his rule among educated Roman populations. The presence of distinguished scholars like Cassiodorus and Boethius at the Ostrogothic court demonstrated the kingdom's success in attracting and retaining the intellectual elite of the late Roman world. Cassiodorus, whose family had served in Roman administrative positions for generations, became one of Theodoric's most trusted advisors and played a crucial role in developing the literary and administrative culture of the Ostrogothic court. His extensive correspondence, preserved in the Variae, provides detailed insights into the governmental operations of the kingdom and demonstrates the sophisticated nature of Ostrogothic administrative practices. The letters reveal a governmental system that maintained Roman legal and administrative traditions while adapting them to the realities of Gothic political control and the challenges of governing a diverse population. The intellectual contributions of Cassiodorus extended beyond administrative duties to encompass historical writing, theological scholarship, and educational theory that would influence European learning for centuries. His Gothic history, written at Theodoric's request, provided a comprehensive account of Gothic origins and achievements that legitimized their rule while connecting them to the broader narrative of European civilization. The work's emphasis on Gothic nobility and their role as defenders of Roman civilization demonstrated the sophisticated nature of Ostrogothic political propaganda and their understanding of the importance of historical narrative for political legitimacy. The establishment of educational institutions under Cassiodorus's direction reflected the Ostrogothic commitment to preserving and transmitting classical learning while adapting it to the needs of their emerging Christian society. The monastery of Vivarium, founded by Cassiodorus after his retirement from governmental service, became a centre for the copying and preservation of classical texts that would prove crucial for the survival of ancient literature during the medieval period. The educational methods developed at Vivarium, which combined classical rhetoric with Christian theology, provided models for medieval education that would influence European learning for centuries. Boethius, whose philosophical writings would become fundamental texts for medieval European thought, exemplified the intellectual achievements possible within the cultural environment of Theodoric's court. His translations of Aristotelian logic and his original philosophical works created bridges between classical Greek thought and medieval Christian philosophy that would prove essential for the development of scholastic theology. The Consolation of Philosophy, written during his imprisonment and shortly before his execution, demonstrated the continuation of classical philosophical traditions within the Christian context of the Ostrogothic kingdom. The tragic fate of Boethius, executed in 524 AD on charges of treason, reflected the growing tensions between Gothic and Roman elements within the kingdom as religious and political conflicts intensified during Theodoric's later years. The philosopher's correspondence with Byzantine officials, while possibly innocent, occurred during a period of increasing suspicion about Roman loyalty and growing pressure from Constantinople for religious conformity. The execution of such a prominent intellectual figure damaged Theodoric's reputation among educated Romans and contributed to the growing opposition to Gothic rule. The architectural achievements of the Ostrogothic period represented a distinctive synthesis of Roman building techniques with Germanic decorative traditions that created new forms of artistic expression. The construction projects undertaken in Ravenna during Theodoric's reign, including the expansion of the palace complex and the construction of new churches, demonstrated both the kingdom's prosperity and its commitment to monumental architecture. The mausoleum of Theodoric, completed shortly before his death, exemplified the unique architectural style that emerged from the combination of Roman engineering with Germanic artistic preferences. The decorative programs developed for Ostrogothic buildings incorporated traditional Germanic animal motifs with Roman architectural elements and Christian symbolism, creating artistic traditions that would influence European art for centuries. The mosaics and sculptures produced in Ravenna during this period demonstrate the sophisticated nature of Ostrogothic artistic patronage and their ability to attract skilled craftsmen from throughout the Mediterranean world. The integration of diverse artistic traditions created distinctive styles that reflected the multicultural nature of the kingdom while maintaining coherent aesthetic principles. The military organisation of the Ostrogothic kingdom combined traditional Gothic warrior culture with Roman military discipline and equipment to create one of the most effective fighting forces of the early medieval period. The Gothic army maintained its traditional emphasis on personal loyalty and tribal identity, while adopting Roman training methods, siege techniques, and logistical systems. The integration of Roman military engineering with Gothic tactical flexibility created hybrid forces capable of both offensive campaigns and defensive operations against various types of enemies. The recruitment policies pursued by Theodoric reflected his understanding of the importance of maintaining Gothic military identity while incorporating useful elements from other populations. The Gothic army included not only traditional tribal warriors, but also Roman veterans, barbarian allies, and specialized troops recruited from various ethnic groups within the kingdom. This diverse military organization required sophisticated command structures and training programs that demonstrated the administrative capabilities of the Ostrogothic state. The diplomatic relationships established by Theodoric with neighbouring kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire reflected his sophisticated understanding of international politics and his commitment to maintaining the balance of power that enabled his kingdom's survival. The Gothic king's marriage alliances with Vandal, Burgundian, and Frankish royal families created networks of political connection that enhanced his diplomatic influence while providing security against potential enemies. The careful management of relationships with Constantinople required constant attention to the complex dynamics of imperial politics and the changing priorities of Byzantine foreign policy. The religious tensions that increasingly characterized the later years of Theodoric's reign reflected the growing pressure from Constantinople for religious conformity and the rising influence of Catholic clergy within the kingdom. The Byzantine Emperor Justin's persecution of Arian Christians created diplomatic crises that forced Theodoric to choose between loyalty to his Gothic subjects and accommodation with imperial demands. The king's increasingly harsh treatment of Catholic clergy and Roman nobles reflected his growing paranoia about religious and political loyalty as external pressures mounted. The succession crisis that followed Theodoric's death in 526 AD revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the Ostrogothic political system and the challenges of maintaining Gothic rule over a predominantly Roman population. The minority of Theodoric's grandson Alaric, combined with the regency of his mother Amalasuntha, created opportunities for both internal opposition and external intervention that would ultimately lead to the kingdom's destruction. The political instability that characterized the post-Theodoric period demonstrated the extent to which the kingdom's success had depended on the personal abilities and authority of its founder. The cultural legacy of the Ostrogothic kingdom extended far beyond its relatively brief political existence to influence European civilization in fundamental ways, yet this remarkable achievement would face its greatest test in the ambitious reconquest campaigns launched by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. The emperor's vision of restoring the Roman Empire to its former territorial extent drove him to undertake military operations that would ultimately destroy the Gothic kingdoms while devastating the very territories he sought to reclaim. The Gothic Wars, spanning nearly 2 decades from 535 to 554 AD, would witness the final confrontation between the heirs of ancient Rome and the Germanic peoples who had inherited its western territories. Justinian's decision to launch the reconquest of Italy reflected both his genuine belief in the possibility of imperial restoration and his assessment of Ostrogothic vulnerabilities following the succession crisis that had plagued the kingdom since Theodoric's death. The minority rule of Alaric under his mother, Amalasuntha's regency, had created political instability that Byzantine agents exploited through diplomatic intrigue and the cultivation of pro-imperial factions among both Gothic nobles and Roman populations. The assassination of Amalasuntha in 535 AD by her cousin Theodahad provided Justinian with the pretext he needed to justify military intervention as a response to the murder of a woman who had maintained friendly relations with Constantinople. The initial Byzantine invasion of Italy began with a carefully coordinated campaign that demonstrated the sophisticated military planning capabilities of Justinian's generals. Belisarius, the emperor's most capable commander, landed in Sicily with a relatively small force of approximately 7,500 men, including both regular Byzantine troops and barbarian foederati recruited from various Germanic tribes. The choice of Sicily as the initial target reflected sound strategic thinking, as the island's conquest would provide a secure base for subsequent operations, while cutting off potential Vandal assistance to the Ostrogoths. The rapid conquest of Sicily during 535 AD revealed both the effectiveness of Byzantine military organisation and the weakness of Ostrogothic defences in the kingdom's peripheral territories. The Gothic garrisons, undermanned and poorly supplied, offered minimal resistance to Belisarius' advance, while the local populations generally welcomed the Byzantine forces as liberators from barbarian rule. The ease of this initial success convinced Justinian that the reconquest of Italy would require relatively modest resources and could be completed within a few years. The Byzantine invasion of the Italian mainland in 536 AD encountered significantly stronger Gothic resistance as Belisarius' forces moved northward from their Sicilian base. The Gothic king Theodoric, despite his reputation for weakness and indecision, had managed to organise defensive preparations that included the fortification of key cities and the concentration of military forces in strategic positions. The Gothic strategy emphasised the defence of fortified positions while avoiding open battle against Byzantine forces that possessed superior discipline and equipment. The Siege of Naples demonstrated the tactical innovations that characterised Byzantine military operations during the Gothic Wars. Belisarius' forces employed sophisticated siege techniques, including the construction of elaborate earthworks and the use of specialised siege engines that could breach the city's ancient walls. The Byzantine employment of Hunnic horse archers provided them with tactical advantages in mobility and firepower that Gothic forces struggled to counter. The fall of Naples after a siege lasting several weeks provided the Byzantines with their first major victory on the Italian mainland and demonstrated their capability for sustained siege operations. The capture of Rome in December 536 AD marked a crucial turning point in the Gothic Wars and revealed the extent of popular support for Byzantine rule among the Italian populations. The city's Gothic garrison, outnumbered and demoralised by news of defeats elsewhere, offered minimal resistance to Belisarius' approach. The Roman population, which had maintained memories of imperial rule and resented Gothic domination, actively assisted the Byzantine forces in securing control of the city. The restoration of imperial authority in the ancient capital provided Justinian with enormous propaganda value while establishing a secure base for further operations. The Gothic response to the loss of Rome demonstrated the resilience of their military organisation and their ability to adapt to changing strategic circumstances. The new Gothic king Visigoths, who had deposed the ineffective Theodoric, assembled a substantial army that included not only traditional Gothic warriors but also Burgundian allies and various other Germanic groups who feared Byzantine expansion. The Gothic force, numbering approximately 30,000 men, represented one of the largest barbarian armies assembled during the 6th century and demonstrated the continued vitality of Gothic military culture. The Siege of Rome from 537 to 538 AD witnessed some of the most intense fighting of the entire Gothic Wars as Vitiges attempted to recapture the symbolic heart of his kingdom. The Gothic forces constructed elaborate siege works that surrounded the city with fortified camps connected by communication trenches and supply lines. The Gothic employment of siege engines, including battering rams and catapults constructed by Roman engineers who had joined their cause, demonstrated their adaptation of imperial military technology to their own tactical requirements. The defence of Rome under Belisarius' command revealed the tactical brilliance that made him one of the greatest military commanders of the ancient world. The Byzantine general transformed the city's ancient walls into a sophisticated defensive system that incorporated new artillery positions and reinforced gates capable of withstanding Gothic assault. The Byzantine use of mounted archers and heavy cavalry in coordinated sorties disrupted Gothic siege operations while maintaining pressure on their extended lines of communication. The Gothic attempts to cut off Rome's water supply by blocking the aqueducts demonstrated their understanding of siege warfare principles and their willingness to employ strategies that would affect civilian populations. The destruction of several major aqueducts forced the Roman population to rely on wells and the Tiber River for water, creating sanitation problems that threatened to undermine the city's ability to withstand prolonged siege. The Gothic strategy of environmental warfare reflected their adaptation to the realities of fighting against a fortified enemy with superior resources. The arrival of Byzantine reinforcements under the general Narses in 538 AD provided Belisarius with the additional troops necessary to break the Gothic siege through coordinated attacks on their fortified positions. The combined Byzantine assault, launched simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelmed Gothic defensive preparations and forced Vitiges to abandon his siege works. The Gothic withdrawal from Rome marked the failure of their most ambitious attempt to recapture the city and demonstrated the superiority of Byzantine military organisation and tactical coordination. The campaign of 539-540 AD witnessed the systematic reduction of Gothic strongholds throughout central and northern Italy as Byzantine forces exploited their victory at Rome. The capture of cities like Fiesole, Orvieto, and Auximus required sophisticated siege operations that demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Byzantine military engineering. The Gothic defensive strategy, which emphasized the protection of fortified positions while avoiding open battle, proved inadequate against Byzantine forces that possessed superior siege equipment and unlimited time to conduct methodical operations. The temporary Gothic recovery under King Totila beginning in 541 AD demonstrated the continued vitality of Gothic resistance and their ability to exploit Byzantine weaknesses. Totila, whose name meant immortal in Gothic, proved to be a charismatic leader capable of inspiring fierce loyalty among his warriors while implementing innovative military and political strategies. His success in recapturing much of central Italy reflected both his tactical brilliance and his understanding of the importance of winning popular support among Italian populations. Totila's military innovations included the development of more flexible tactical formations that could adapt to various battlefield conditions while maintaining the traditional Gothic emphasis on personal courage and aggressive action. The Gothic forces under his command combined traditional infantry tactics with improved cavalry units that incorporated techniques learned from Byzantine opponents. The Gothic adoption of siege warfare methods, including the construction of sophisticated earthworks and the employment of artillery, demonstrated their continued ability to adapt to changing military requirements. The recapture of Rome by Totila in 546 AD represented the high point of Gothic military recovery and demonstrated their continued capacity for major strategic operations. The Gothic assault on the city employed coordinated attacks on multiple gates while maintaining pressure on the walls through artillery bombardment. The fall of Rome after a siege lasting several months provided the Goths with enormous psychological advantages while demonstrating the limitations of Byzantine defensive capabilities when confronted by determined and well-organised opponents. The Gothic occupation of Rome under Totila's leadership revealed his sophisticated understanding of political symbolism and his desire to present himself as a legitimate ruler rather than a barbarian conqueror. The Gothic king's restoration of Roman governmental institutions, combined with his protection of civilian populations and religious establishments, demonstrated his commitment to maintaining the cultural synthesis that had characterized the Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric. The Gothic treatment of Roman senators and intellectuals reflected their continued respect for classical learning and their desire to maintain continuity with imperial traditions. The Byzantine response to Gothic resurgence required fundamental changes in imperial strategy and the commitment of substantially increased military resources. Justinian's decision to recall Belisarius from other campaigns and provide him with reinforcements demonstrated the emperor's recognition of the Gothic threat and his determination to complete the reconquest of Italy, regardless of cost. The renewed Byzantine offensive that began in 547 AD involved larger armies and more systematic approaches to territorial control than had characterized earlier phases of the conflict. The final phase of the Gothic Wars witnessed increasingly desperate resistance as Gothic forces faced overwhelming Byzantine advantages in manpower, resources and strategic positioning. The death of Totila at the Battle of Tagenay in 552 AD eliminated the most capable Gothic leader and marked the beginning of the end for organised Gothic resistance. The battle itself demonstrated the tactical superiority of Byzantine forces under Narcissus' command, as disciplined infantry formations supported by cavalry and archery units systematically destroyed Gothic military organisation. The last Gothic king, Teia, attempted to continue resistance from strongholds in southern Italy, but his forces lacked the leadership and resources necessary for sustained operations against the overwhelming Byzantine advantage. The Battle of Mons Lactarius in 553 AD, where Teia died fighting desperately against impossible odds, marked the effective end of the Ostrogothic kingdom and the completion of Justinian's reconquest of Italy. The Gothic warrior tradition, which had dominated Italian politics for over half a century, came to an end with the death of their final king on a battlefield in Campania. The aftermath of the Gothic Wars left Italy devastated and depopulated, with many of the cities and agricultural regions that had prospered under Ostrogothic rule lying in ruins. The prolonged conflict had disrupted trade relationships, destroyed infrastructure, and created demographic catastrophes that would require generations to repair. The Byzantine victory, while achieving Justinian's territorial objectives, had come at a cost that made the reconquered territories more liability than asset for the empire. The fate of the surviving Gothic populations following their military defeat varied significantly depending on their location and their willingness to accept Byzantine rule. Many Gothic warriors and their families fled northward into territories controlled by the Lombards or other Germanic peoples, where they could maintain their cultural identity while escaping imperial persecution. Others accepted integration into Byzantine society, abandoning their Gothic identity in favour of Roman citizenship and the opportunities it provided for advancement within the imperial system. While the Ostrogothic kingdom met its end in the devastation of Justinian's wars, the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania continued to flourish and evolve throughout the 6th and 7th centuries. The Visigothic rulers had learned from the fate of their Italian cousins and developed more effective strategies for maintaining independence while adapting to the changing political landscape of early medieval Europe. The conversion of the Visigothic royal family to Catholic Christianity under King Ricard in 589 AD eliminated the primary religious barrier that had separated Gothic and Hispano-Roman populations, facilitating the emergence of a unified Spanish Christian culture. The administrative and legal achievements of the Visigothic kingdom during its final centuries represented some of the most sophisticated governmental innovations of the early medieval period. The Liber Judiciorum, completed under King Receswinth in 654 AD, created a comprehensive legal system that applied equally to all inhabitants of the kingdom, regardless of their ethnic background. This legal code, which combined Germanic customary law with Roman legal principles, would influence Spanish legal development for centuries and provide models for other European kingdoms. The cultural synthesis achieved by the Visigothic kingdom during the 7th century created distinctive traditions in art, architecture and literature that reflected the successful integration of Gothic and Roman elements. The construction of churches like San Juan de Baños and Santa Maria de Melk demonstrated the development of a uniquely Visigothic architectural style that combined Germanic decorative traditions with Roman building techniques. The literary works produced at the Visigothic court, including the historical writings of Isidore of Seville, contributed to the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge during the early medieval period The military organisation of the late Visigothic kingdom reflected the ongoing challenges of defending extensive territories against both internal rebellion and external invasion. The Gothic army maintained its traditional emphasis on heavy cavalry while incorporating new tactical formations and siege techniques learned from Byzantine and Frankish opponents. The kingdom's defensive strategy relied on a network of fortified cities and strategic strongholds that could coordinate resistance against invading forces while maintaining control over agricultural regions. The political instability that characterized the Visigothic kingdom during the early 8th century created vulnerabilities that would ultimately lead to its destruction. The succession disputes that followed the death of King Witiza in 710 AD divided the Gothic nobility into competing factions that weakened the kingdom's ability to respond to external threats. The civil war between Roderick and Aquila provided opportunities for foreign intervention that would prove fatal to Gothic independence. The Muslim invasion of Hispania in 711 AD under Tariq ibn Ziyad exploited the political divisions within the Visigothic kingdom while demonstrating the military superiority of Islamic forces. The Muslim army, numbering approximately 7,000 men, included both Arab cavalry and Berber infantry units that possessed superior mobility and coordination compared to Gothic forces. The Islamic employment of mounted archers and flexible tactical formations provided significant advantages against Gothic heavy cavalry that relied on frontal charges and close combat. The Battle of Guadalete in 711 AD marked the decisive engagement that destroyed Visigothic resistance and opened Hispania to Muslim conquest. The Gothic army under King Roderick, numbering approximately 25,000 men, attempted to prevent the Muslim advance through a traditional defensive strategy that emphasized the protection of river crossings and strategic positions. The Gothic battle formation, consisting of heavy cavalry in the centre supported by infantry on the flanks, reflected their traditional tactical preferences and their confidence in their military superiority. The Muslim tactical approach at Guadalete demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated cavalry and infantry operations against opponents who lacked comparable mobility and flexibility. The Islamic forces employed feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers that disrupted Gothic formations, while avoiding direct confrontation with their heavily armoured opponents. The Muslim use of archery and javelin attacks gradually weakened Gothic resistance, while maintaining their own tactical flexibility and unit cohesion. The death of King Roderick during the battle eliminated Gothic leadership and led to the complete collapse of organised resistance throughout the kingdom. The Gothic nobility, demoralised by their king's death and the destruction of their army, proved incapable of coordinating effective defensive measures against the rapidly advancing Muslim forces. The speed of the Islamic conquest, which brought most of Hispania under Muslim control within 3 years, demonstrated the extent of Visigothic political and military collapse. The aftermath of Guadalete witnessed the systematic destruction of Visigothic political institutions and the establishment of Islamic rule throughout the peninsula. The Muslim conquest eliminated the last major Gothic kingdom and ended nearly 3 centuries of Germanic rule in Hispania. The surviving Gothic populations faced the choice between conversion to Islam, acceptance of dhimmi status as Christian subjects, or flight to the northern mountains where small Christian kingdoms would eventually emerge. The legacy of Gothic civilization extended far beyond the political boundaries of their kingdoms to influence European development in fundamental ways. The legal codes developed by both Visigothic and Ostrogothic rulers provided models for medieval jurisprudence that would influence European legal development for centuries. The breviary of Alaric and the Liber Judiciorum demonstrated the possibility of creating unified legal systems that could govern diverse populations while maintaining both Germanic and Roman legal traditions. The architectural achievements of Gothic builders created distinctive styles that combined Roman engineering techniques with Germanic decorative traditions. The churches, palaces and fortifications constructed during the Gothic period established architectural precedents that would influence European building practices throughout the medieval period. The Gothic emphasis on a monumental stone construction, combined with their sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture, contributed to the development of castle-building techniques that would dominate European warfare for centuries. The preservation of classical learning within Gothic kingdoms, particularly through the efforts of scholars like Cassiodorus and Isidore of Seville, proved crucial for the transmission of ancient knowledge to medieval Europe. The Gothic commitment to education and their patronage of scholarly activities created institutional frameworks that enabled the survival of classical texts and philosophical traditions during the political chaos of the early medieval period. The libraries and schools established under Gothic rule provided models for medieval educational institutions that would preserve and transmit European intellectual traditions. The concept of Germanic kingship developed within Gothic political culture influenced European governmental traditions in ways that extended far beyond the Gothic kingdoms themselves. The Gothic synthesis of traditional Germanic assembly democracy with Roman administrative practices created new forms of royal authority that balanced monarchical power with aristocratic participation. The Gothic legal principle that kings ruled under law rather than above it contributed to the development of constitutional monarchy concepts that would influence European political development for centuries. The religious contributions of Gothic Christianity, particularly the theological and liturgical traditions developed within Arian communities, influenced European Christian development despite their eventual suppression by Catholic orthodoxy. The Gothic translation of the Bible into vernacular language provided models for later efforts to make Christian texts accessible to non-Latin speaking populations. The Gothic emphasis on the relationship between political authority and religious legitimacy contributed to medieval concepts of divine kingship while maintaining the principle that royal power derived from popular consent. The military innovations developed by Gothic armies influenced European warfare throughout the medieval period. The Gothic integration of infantry and cavalry tactics, combined with their sophisticated understanding of siege warfare, provided models for military organisation that would be adopted by Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and other European kingdoms. The Gothic emphasis on personal loyalty and warrior culture contributed to the development of feudal military systems that would dominate European warfare for centuries. As the last Gothic strongholds fell to Muslim conquest in Hispania, and the final Ostrogothic resistance was crushed in Italy, the political independence of the Gothic peoples came to an end after nearly 4 centuries of achievement and influence. Yet their legacy lived on in the legal codes, architectural styles, educational institutions and governmental practices they had bequeathed to European civilization. The Gothic experience demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of barbarian adaptation to Roman civilization, creating cultural syntheses that would influence European development long after their kingdoms had disappeared from the political map. The twilight of the Gothic kingdoms marked not merely the end of a particular group of Germanic peoples, but the conclusion of the great age of barbarian kingdoms that had transformed the Roman world into the foundation of medieval Europe.